Before ancient Greece became a name written in books, before its warriors and poets and philosophers shaped the world, there was only a landscape of stone and sea, a long coastline unraveling like a thread, mountains rising sharply from the earth, breaking the horizon into jagged silhouettes. Thousands of islands scattered across the Aegean like fragments of an old creation story. This land was never quiet, but it was never still either. The winds that swept across its ridges carried the smell of pine and salt, brushing gently through narrow valleys. In the early mornings, the light spilled over the hills in soft gold, turning the olive trees into shimmering silver shapes. At night, the skies stretched open, a deep vault of stars guiding sailors from one island to the next. Long before writing, before temples or tales of gods, small groups of people lived close to the earth. They fished in the shallow bays, followed the seasons, and watched the slow movement of the constellations above them. Life was simple, shaped by the rhythms of nature. Yet each passing generation left small traces, a pebble tool, a hearth, the outline of a village, quiet markers of humanity taking root in a rugged land. Greece is a place where geography shapes destiny. The mountains kept communities apart, encouraging independence and distinct identities. The sea connected those same communities, carrying ideas, goods, and stories from one shore to another. Through these currents, the earliest cultures began to form, each influenced by the same landscape, but shaped in unique ways. Travelers moving along the coast would have seen long inlets reaching deep into the land, natural harbors waiting for the first ships. They would have seen steep cliffs where goats moved like shadows, and terraces carved into hillsides for early crops of barley and wheat. These landscapes, so familiar to later generations, were just beginning to define the people who lived among them. In time, these quiet settlements grew into villages, and those villages would eventually become city-states. But that transformation lay far ahead. In this distant beginning, Greece was not yet the Greece of philosophy and democracy, not yet the land of marble temples or heroic legends. It was simply a place of possibility, a mosaic of distinct regions, each waiting for its own story to unfold. To the north, broad plains met forests and rivers. To the south, the Peloponnese formed a world of its own, shaped by deep bays and rugged interior mountains. The islands dotted through the Aegean formed stepping stones between continents, places where early traders learned the language of the sea. And to the east, beyond the horizon, lay Anatolia, a vast land whose cultures would intertwine with Greece for thousands of years. This setting, mountains that encouraged independence, seas that encouraged travel, and a climate that allowed year-round life outdoors, created something rare in human history. It formed a world where ideas could move freely, where stories and customs blended, and where new forms of society could slowly take shape. Before any myths were written down, they were carried on the wind as spoken memories. Before temples were built, people gathered around simple altars of stone. Before heroes and philosophers left their mark, the land itself shaped the imagination of those who lived upon it. The rugged beauty of Greece, the cliffs, coves, plains, forests, and islands, served as the quiet foundation upon which everything else would rise. In this world of early farmers and fishermen, the first patterns of culture emerged. People learned the seasons of the sea, the behavior of storms, the cycles of harvests. They began carving simple figurines, decorating pottery, and shaping the earliest forms of art. These creations, though humble, revealed something essential: a growing sense of identity, a desire to record experience, and a need to understand the forces that surrounded them. And so, slowly, the land gave birth to civilization. From its scattered villages came the first great cultures of the Aegean, the Cycladic islanders, the Minoans of Crete, and the Mycenaeans of the mainland each would rise, flourish, and fade, leaving behind echoes that would shape the centuries to come. But before their stories begin, we linger for a moment in this landscape at the edge of memory, a land where the light falls softly across the earth, where the sea whispers against the shore, and where the first people of Greece looked out at the horizon without knowing the extraordinary world they were about to shape. Here, in the stillness of these early days, the story of ancient Greece begins, quietly, slowly, carried forward by time like a gentle tide moving through the islands. Long before the first palaces rose on Crete, long before the mainland echoed with the footsteps of Mycenaean warriors, the Aegean world was entering one of the quietest and most transformative periods in human history. The land was changing, little by little, guided not by kings or armies, but by the simple daily choices of early people who lived close to the soil, the wind, and the rhythm of the sea. By around 7000 BCE, small groups of settlers began to appear across the regions that would later become Greece. They were not yet Greeks in any cultural or linguistic sense. They were early farmers, travellers, and foragers who carried with them the knowledge of agriculture from the lands of the Near East. Their arrival marked the beginning of the Neolithic Age in the Aegean, a time when life began to shift from wandering to settling, from temporary camps to permanent homes. They chose places where the land was kind, shallow valleys where rivers flowed gently, hillsides where sunlight warmed the soil, coastal plains opening to the quiet curves of sheltered bays. In these places, they built homes from wood, reeds, and packed earth. Simple structures, but strong enough to withstand winter rains and the winds that swept across the landscape. Farming slowly replaced the uncertainty of foraging. Barley and wheat became staple crops, grown in small fields scratched from the earth. Goats and sheep were raised for milk, wool, and meat. Clay ovens appeared beside houses, leaving behind fragments of pottery hardened by fire, some plain, some decorated with simple lines or dots. These patterns, though modest, reveal a growing sense of creativity, an early spark of expression that would one day flourish into the distinctive art of the ancient world. Villages developed gradually, with houses clustered close enough for safety and cooperation. In some regions, these early communities grew into surprisingly large settlements for their time. The archaeological site of Sesklo, in Thessaly, is one of the oldest known in Europe. Around 6000 BCE, it was already a thriving village, home to hundreds of people living in arranged neighborhoods. Nearby Dimony would join it centuries later, featuring circular enclosures that hint at the earliest attempts at organized communal space. Life in these communities unfolded at a slow, steady pace. In the mornings, people tended fields and animals. Children gathered reeds from riverbanks, shaped clay, or helped their families carry water from wells. Evenings brought families together to share meals, often consisting of grains, pulses, olives, wild greens, and occasionally fish or meat. The landscape around them, the hills, plains, and coastlines, provided just enough, allowing early societies to anchor themselves in place. Although simple, their world was not isolated. Evidence of small-scale trade appears as early as the Neolithic. Obsidian from the island of Milos, a volcanic glass prized for sharp tools, has been found across mainland sites far from the sea. Its presence suggests that people were already travelling between islands, navigating short distances by boat, long before the rise of complex maritime cultures. These journeys, though undertaken in simple vessels, carried with them the first threads of connection across the Aegean. As centuries passed, communities grew more permanent. Houses became sturdier, sometimes with stone foundations. Pottery became more refined, shifting from purely functional to subtly artistic designs, grew more sophisticated. Swirling lines, geometric forms, and patterns that echoed the natural world. These developments did not appear suddenly. They moved slowly, shaped by generations of hands, shaping clay and telling stories through simple decoration. Burial customs also reveal a growing complexity in belief. Some communities place their dead beneath their homes or in nearby cemeteries, carefully arranging the bodies and sometimes including simple offerings, tools, beads, or small figurines. These gestures hint at early ideas of memory, respect, and perhaps an emerging sense of the sacred. The islands of the Aegean began developing their own patterns of settlement. Places like Chaea and Naxos show early traces of farming communities, while others remained sparsely populated. Travel between islands would grow easier over time, allowing ideas and goods to spread in gradual waves. Though small in numbers, these early islanders were shaping the future maritime character of Greek civilization. From 5000 to 4000 BCE, the Neolithic world reached its peak across the region. Settlements expanded, agriculture intensified, and pottery styles diversified. Some communities experimented with new forms of architecture, including longhouses and multi-room dwellings. Social structures slowly became more organized, though still without the rigid hierarchies that later eras would develop. Tools improved too. Stone axes became sharper and more polished. Bone and horn were carved into needles, awls, and fishing gear. Weaving emerged as a crucial skill, providing clothing and textiles that rarely survive today but once filled homes with color and texture. These small innovations, domestic, practical, uncelebrated, laid the foundation for all that would come later. Around 4000 BCE, subtle changes began sweeping through the region. Climate shifts altered harvest cycles. Communities interacted more widely with neighboring regions, perhaps encouraged by new trade opportunities. Population movements brought fresh ideas and techniques. Slowly, the Aegean world transitioned from the Neolithic into the early stages of the Copper Age. The introduction of copper marked a quiet revolution. Although stone tools remained dominant for centuries, copper allowed for new kinds of craftsmanship, metal ornaments, small blades, and early tools began appearing in graves and homes. The knowledge of metalworking, even at this early stage, hinted at the technological advances that would define the coming millennia. By 3500 BCE, the Aegean was no longer a region of scattered farming villages alone. It was becoming a network of communities connected through sea routes, shared practices, and mutual exchange. These people did not build monuments or write their histories, but their influence is profound. They created stability where there had once been uncertainty. They developed the early patterns of trade, architecture, pottery, and community life that formed the bedrock of the civilizations to come. As the Neolithic Age drew to a close around 3000 BCE, the stage was set for the next chapter in the story of Greece. New forces were awakening, in the islands, on the coasts, and deep within the changing landscape. The quiet rhythm of early farming life was about to give way to something far more dynamic. On the island of Crete, a culture was beginning to take shape. One that would soon build the first palaces of the Aegean, paint walls with vivid frescoes, and create a peaceful maritime world unlike anything the region had known before. The Minoans were stirring, and the Bronze Age was about to begin. In the center of the Aegean Sea lies a scattered circle of islands, windswept, dry, and carved by time. Today they are known as the Cyclades, named for their ring-like formation around the sacred island of Delos. But thousands of years ago, before Greece had temples or written myths, these islands were home to one of the earliest and most enigmatic cultures of the ancient world. The Cycladic people emerged quietly around 3200 BCE. They lived on islands such as Naxos, Paros, Syros, Amorgos, and Keros. Places shaped by steep cliffs and limited farmland. Rain was rare, soil was thin, and fresh water was precious. Yet despite these harsh conditions, life flourished in small coastal communities, Fishing, herding, and modest farming sustained them. Sea travel connected them, and a unique artistic vision set their culture apart in ways that still feel strangely modern. Simple stone houses clustered along sheltered bays. The people who built them were skilled sailors, navigating between islands in long, narrow boats. The sea was their road, their lifeline, and their greatest teacher. Through maritime routes, they exchanged obsidian, pottery, and marble with distant settlements. These early networks formed a quiet web across the Aegean, connecting island to island long before the rise of great kingdoms. The Cycladic world is especially remembered for its craftsmanship with marble, a material that was abundant on islands like Paros and Naxos, while other early cultures carved figurines from clay or soft stone. The Cycladic people shaped gleaming white marble into smooth, delicate forms. The most famous of these are the enigmatic Cycladic figurines, stylized human shapes with folded arms, elongated features, and faces often left blank except for a single serene nose. These figurines, some only a few centimeters tall and others nearly life-sized, have become icons of early Aegean art. Their minimalist design feels almost modern, as if they were carved by an artist from the 20th century, rather than by craftsmen of the Bronze Age. Their purpose remains uncertain. Many were found in graves, placed beside the dead. Others were broken deliberately and scattered across sites, possibly part of ritual practices. We can only imagine their mystery endures, preserved in marble that time cannot easily erase. Villages varied in size. Some consisted of small clusters of homes overlooking the sea. Others became modest centers of community life. On the island of Syros, the settlement of Chalandriani and its cemetery offer a vivid glimpse into Cycladic society. There, carefully arranged graves contained pottery, obsidian blades, jewelry made of shell or bronze, and the iconic figurines. These offerings suggest a culture attentive to ritual and memory, one that honored its dead with quiet ceremony. Beyond art and burial practices, the Cycladic people were accomplished sailors. Their boats likely resembled long wooden craft, light and efficient, perfect for navigating between the islands. They transported marble, obsidian, pottery, and perhaps textiles. They learned to read the winds, the currents, and the seasonal patterns of the sea. This maritime skill made them essential participants in early Aegean trade networks. Metalworking began to spread during this period as well. Copper tools and ornaments became more common across the islands. Although bronze, the alloy of copper and tin, was still developing, early metal objects signaled an emerging technological shift. Small daggers, pins, and chisels appeared in graves, reflecting both utility and the symbolic importance of metal. By 2800 BCE, Cycladic culture was thriving. Settlements grew in complexity. Pottery styles diversified with swirling lines, geometric motifs, and soft curves painted in red or black marble bowls, vases, and frying pan-shaped objects, whose purpose remains unknown, were crafted with precision. Some believe these shallow decorated objects may have held water for ritual reflections or serve symbolic functions related to the sea or fertility. However, this flourishing world did not remain static. Around 2500 BCE, subtle shifts began to occur across the islands. External influences from Crete, Anatolia, and the mainland increased trade intensified. New cultural elements appeared in pottery and architecture. Over time, the distinctiveness of Cycladic culture gradually blended into the wider Aegean world. Violence may have played a role as well. Fortified settlements began to emerge, suggesting concerns about raids or competition over resources. The once peaceful network of island communities may have faced increasing strain as trade routes shifted and populations grew. By around 2000 BCE, Cycladic culture as a dominant regional force was fading. Many island settlements depopulated or reorganized. Influences from the rising Minoan civilization on Crete began to spread across the Aegean, shaping art, trade, and social structures. Some Cycladic traditions survived, woven into the broader tapestry of Aegean culture, while others vanished into the quiet of history. Today, the marble figurines remain the most enduring legacy of this civilization. They stand in museums around the world, silent, elegant forms carved by hands that lived 5,000 years ago. Their folded arms and expressionless faces speak of a people who mastered simplicity, balance, and restraint long before the classical age. The Cycladic world was not grand. It built no towering palaces and left no epic tales. But it carried early Aegean culture across the sea, connecting islands that might otherwise have remained isolated. It laid the maritime foundations upon which later civilizations would rise, and it left behind a sense of mystery, a quiet echo of a society that lived with the sea, shaped by stone, and attuned to the subtle rhythms of an ancient world. As this chapter of early island culture fades, another begins to rise to the south. On the island of Crete, a new civilization was taking shape, one of colour, harmony, and extraordinary complexity. A culture that would soon dominate the Aegean and leave the first great architectural footprint of Greek prehistory. The Minoans were emerging, and with them, the dawn of the Bronze Age in full. South of the scattered Cyclades lies a long, rugged island shaped like a sleeping giant. This is Crete, a land of high mountains, fertile plains, deep gorges, and harbours protected from the open sea. It was here, around 3000 BCE, that one of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient world began to take form, the Minoans. The Minoan story starts quietly, with early farming communities much like those of the mainland and islands. These early Cretans cultivated grains, herded sheep and goats, and lived in modest stone houses. But their island offered something extraordinary: natural harbours, fertile land, and a location at the crossroads between Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant. The sea connected them to distant worlds, bringing ideas, goods, and opportunities. With time, these advantages transformed Crete into a thriving centre of Aegean life. Around 2600 BCE, the first signs of cultural complexity appeared. Pottery styles became more refined, homes grew larger, and trade expanded. Craftsmen experimented with seal stones, small carved objects used to stamp clay, suggesting a growing administrative structure. The island's population increased, and communities began clustering into regional centres. This early phase, known as the Prepalatial period, laid the groundwork for the monumental changes that would follow. By 2000 BCE, Crete entered what historians call the Protopalatial period, the age of the first palaces. These were not palaces in the sense of royal residences alone. They functioned as administrative hubs, religious centres, storehouses, and gathering places. The most famous of these early palaces arose at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia. Though their earliest forms were destroyed and rebuilt over centuries, they reveal a society capable of sophisticated organisation. The architecture of these palaces was unlike anything seen in the Aegean before. Multi-storey buildings with staircases, large central courtyards, storerooms lined with massive clay pythoi, and complex systems of corridors and rooms suggest a society both orderly and inventive. Some believe the palaces served as ceremonial centres. Others see them as administrative complexes. Most agree they played a role in coordinating the island's agricultural and economic activities. Life in Minoan Crete was vibrant. The people adorned their homes with frescoes painted in rich colours, deep reds, blues, and yellows. These artworks depicted scenes of nature, marine life, religious rituals, and athletic activities. Unlike the later Greek emphasis on warfare, Minoan art rarely shows battles or conquests. Instead, dolphins leap across walls, lilies bloom in painted meadows, and figures dance, leap, or gather in ceremonies. There is a sense of movement, harmony, and joy woven into the art of Crete. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of Minoan culture is the bull. Bulls appear in frescoes, carved figurines, and seal stones. Bull leaping, an athletic and ritualistic activity, is depicted in several art pieces. Young men and women grasping the horns of a charging bull or somersaulting over its back in a display of skill and bravery. The meaning of this ritual remains debated: religious, athletic, symbolic, but its energy captures the spirit of Minoan life, bold, graceful, and full of motion. Religious practices centered around nature and fertility. Mountain peaks, caves, and sacred groves were important sites of worship. Female figures appear prominently in Minoan iconography, often interpreted as goddesses or priestesses, suggesting a religion deeply connected to the natural cycles of life. The famous snake goddess figurines, with their expressive poses and elaborate costumes, reflect a spiritual world filled with symbolism and mystery. Trade connected Crete to far-reaching places. Minoan ships travelled across the Mediterranean, carrying pottery, textiles, and crafted goods. In return, they received copper, tin, ivory, and exotic items from lands as distant as Egypt. This commerce enriched the island, transforming it into a major economic force. Around 1700 BCE, the early palaces were destroyed, perhaps by earthquakes, fire, or internal conflict, but the Minoans rebuilt. This ushered in the Neopalatial period, the true golden age of Minoan civilization. The new palaces were grander, more complex, and more beautifully decorated than before. Knossos, under the legendary figure later remembered as King Minos, became a sprawling architectural masterpiece. During this period, writing evolved in the form of Linear A, a script used for administrative purposes. Though undeciphered today, it offers a tantalizing glimpse into Minoan bureaucracy and organization storage rooms filled with clay tablets, suggest a society managing large-scale agriculture, trade, and religious activities. Yet, even a great civilization faces vulnerability. Around 1600 BCE, a massive volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, shook the entire Aegean world. The explosion was one of the most powerful in ancient history. Ash and debris spread across the sea. Tidal waves may have struck coastal settlements, the skies darkened, crops failed, and trade routes faltered. Though Crete survived the immediate destruction, the long-term impact weakened its stability. By 1450 BCE, something changed dramatically. Many Minoan sites were destroyed or abandoned. Knossos survived but came under new management, likely by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. Their presence appears in the adoption of Linear B, the script used by Mycenaeans for administrative records. This marks the beginning of Minoan decline and the rise of Mycenaean dominance. The civilization that once filled its walls with colour and movement faded into memory. Its palaces fell silent, its frescoes crumbled, and its language was lost. But the Minoans left an indelible mark on the ancient world, the first advanced civilization of Europe, a culture of artistry, harmony, and maritime brilliance. As Crete's light dimmed, another power was rising to the north. On the Greek mainland, fortress cities of stone were growing in strength and ambition. The Mycenaeans were emerging, and their age would reshape the Aegean in ways both heroic and tragic. North of Crete, across the restless waters of the Aegean, the Greek mainland was awakening. While Minoan palaces rose with colour and elegance, a different kind of world was forming in the valleys and hills of the Peloponnese. This world was built not on open courtyards and frescoed walls, but on stone fortresses, high walls, and a spirit forged in conflict, exploration, and ambition. This was the world of the Mycenaeans, the first Greeks, the ancestors who would later inspire the legends of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus. Their story begins around 1600 BCE, when powerful families began to emerge across the mainland. These early Mycenaeans inherited much from their Minoan neighbours: art styles, religious symbols, and an admiration for maritime trade. But their temperament was different. They favoured weapons, horses, and displays of power. Their tombs reveal a society that valued prestige and hierarchy. Golden masks, bronze swords, jewellery, and ornate drinking cups were placed beside the dead as signs of status. The earliest centres of Mycenaean power rose in places like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes. These hilltop citadels dominated the surrounding landscape, with high stone walls that would later earn the name Cyclopean, because later Greeks believed only giants could have moved such enormous blocks. Inside the citadels, rulers lived in complexes known as megarons, rectangular halls with central hearths and painted walls, the architectural ancestors of later Greek temples. Around 1450 BCE, something dramatic occurred across the Aegean. The Mycenaeans expanded their influence over Crete. Whether through invasion, migration, or gradual political dominance, mainland Greeks took control of Knossos and integrated elements of Minoan culture into their own. They adopted Linear A and transformed it into Linear B, the earliest written form of Greek. Clay tablets preserved administrative records, inventories of goods, lists of workers, and details of religious offerings. Through these tablets, we hear Greek words spoken for the first time in history. This era, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE, marked the height of Mycenaean civilization. Their influence stretched across the Aegean. Trade routes carried their pottery and goods to Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt, and even the distant shores of Italy, and the Near East ships sailed from fortified harbours, transporting olive oil, wine, textiles, bronze weapons, and finely crafted jars decorated with abstract designs, or stylized plants and animals. While Minoan Crete celebrated harmony and nature in its art, Mycenaean art often reflected strength and order. Helmets fashioned from boar tusks appear in frescoes. Warriors with round shields march across painted walls. Chariots roll through scenes of hunting and battle. The world of the Mycenaeans was one of kings, warriors, and a society deeply shaped by conflict and prestige. Among all the citadels, Mycenae stood supreme. Approaching the city, visitors passed through the monumental Lion Gate, two sculpted lions standing above a massive lintel stone. Inside lay the grave circles, where earlier rulers had been buried under masks of hammered gold, surrounded by treasures that revealed a rich and powerful elite. It was likely during this period that the stories later immortalized by Homer took shape. While the Iliad and the Odyssey were written centuries after the Mycenaeans disappeared, their settings and characters echo this Bronze Age world. Fortified palaces, proud kings, feasts held in grand halls, and warriors bound by honour and reputation. The Trojan War itself, whether historical or mythological, probably reflects real tensions and conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and the cities of Anatolia. But no civilization, however strong, is immune to change. Around 1200 BCE, trouble began to stir across the eastern Mediterranean. This period, known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, saw numerous civilizations weaken or fall. The Hittites, kingdoms in the Levant, and complex societies across Anatolia and Cyprus all faced destruction. The causes remain debated. Climate shifts, earthquakes, internal rebellion, invasions, or the disruption of trade routes. Whatever the reasons, the Mycenaeans did not escape. One by one, their palaces burned, Pylos was destroyed. Mycenae suffered waves of damage. Tiryns and Thebes faltered. Administrative systems collapsed. Linear B writing vanished. Populations decreased as people abandoned citadels for rural settlements. Trade routes dissolved, and the complex economy that had sustained Mycenaean power disappeared. Yet the fall did not erase them. The memory of their world, of great halls, heroic deeds, and proud kings, endured in stories. These stories, carried down through centuries of oral tradition, eventually shaped the epic poems that defined Greek identity. When the Mycenaean Age ended around 1100 BCE, Greece entered one of its most obscure periods. The great palaces were silent, the seas less travelled, and writing forgotten. The Age of Heroes had ended, and a long night was beginning. When the last flames faded from the ruined palaces of the Mycenaean world, Greece entered a chapter unlike any before it. Historians call it the Dark Age, not because the people themselves lived without hope or meaning, but because the evidence they left behind is scarce, quiet, and often difficult to interpret. It is an age of dimming lights, shrinking communities, and a gradual resetting of Greek society. Around 1100 BCE, the great citadels were abandoned or drastically reduced. Without the centralized administrations that once distributed resources, coordinated labor, and managed trade, communities returned to a simpler way of life. Small villages replaced palatial cities. People focused on survival, tending crops and herds on a much smaller scale. Trade diminished sharply, and the connection to distant lands weakened. The population declined across much of the Greek mainland. In some regions, entire valleys that once thrived under Mycenaean rule became nearly empty. Families sought safety in more isolated places, hilltops, small plains, hidden bays. They built modest homes, often of mud brick and timber, far simpler than the stone architecture of the Bronze Age life, became more local, more inward, shaped by the immediate needs of the community. One of the most striking changes was the loss of writing. Linear B, once used to record the workings of palace economies, vanished completely. For centuries afterward, the Greeks lived without a written script. Knowledge, laws, and stories were carried in memory and passed from one generation to the next through oral tradition. Yet this loss also sparked something new: the rise of storytellers, bards, and traditions that would eventually shape Greek identity. The legends of heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, were not written but sung, retold in humble homes and gatherings around the fire. These stories preserved fragments of Mycenaean memory, transformed through centuries of retelling into the epics that would later define Greek literature. The Dark Age was not uniformly bleak. In some regions, life continued with surprising resilience. Small-scale trade never fully disappeared. Communities forged new networks, exchanging pottery, metalwork, and goods with nearby islands or coastal towns. The style of pottery evolved, marked by simpler forms and geometric patterns. Straight lines, circles, and meanders that hinted at future artistic developments. Around 1050 BCE, a new form of pottery known as proto-geometric appeared. It featured clean shapes, carefully measured designs, and a renewed sense of order. This artistic rebirth reflected underlying social changes. As communities stabilized, craftsmanship improved. People began to rebuild a sense of identity, even if on a smaller scale. Burial customs also provide insight into the age. Gone were the elaborate tombs of Mycenaean kings. Instead, people used simple pit or cremation burials. Offerings were modest: pottery, tools, small ornaments. These humble graves speak of a society that valued practicality over display, survival over ceremony. By around 950 BCE, signs of recovery began to appear. populations slowly increased. Villages grew into small towns. Metalworking, especially in iron, became more common. Iron tools and weapons were stronger and more reliable than bronze, giving communities new means to farm, build, and defend themselves. The shift to iron marks a technological transition that would shape Greek life for centuries. As the Dark Age progressed, regional identities developed. Groups like the Dorians, Ionians, and Aeolians emerged with distinct dialects and customs. These divisions, rooted in geography and migration patterns, formed the cultural backbone of later Greek city-states. By 900 to 850 BCE, trade contacts with the Near East revived. Goods from Phoenician merchants, pottery, metals, dyes, and small luxuries began to appear in Greek settlements. These renewed exchanges brought fresh ideas and technologies, setting the stage for profound transformation. One of the most important of these new influences was writing. Around the 8th century BCE, the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet into their own system, adding vowels and creating a flexible, accessible script. For the first time in centuries, words could be written again. This invention would shape everything that followed: law, poetry, philosophy, and the entire intellectual heritage of Greece. By about 800 BCE, the darkness was lifting. The seeds planted in these quiet centuries, storytelling, craftsmanship, new technologies, and local identities, were about to blossom into something extraordinary. Small villages were becoming city-states. Family leaders were becoming magistrates. Markets were growing busier. And people were gathering in shared spaces to discuss matters of common interest. The world of Greece was awakening again, not with the grandeur of palaces, but with the steady rise of communities that valued freedom, debate, and the potential of the human mind. Soon the Archaic Age would begin, and with it, the foundations of the Greece the world remembers. When the long night of the Greek Dark Age began to fade, something subtle and remarkable started to stir across the Aegean. Villages that had once been isolated and fragile began to grow. Trade revived. Workshops hummed with the sound of metal striking metal, and markets slowly came back to life. It was as if a slow dawn was spreading over the land, carrying with it the first warmth after centuries of quiet. By around 800 BCE, Greece was entering the Archaic Age, a period of transformation, experimentation, and creativity. The Greeks did not yet know the greatness their culture would one day achieve, but step by step, they were laying the foundations of their civilization. And one of the most important foundations was the return of writing. During the Dark Age, the Greeks had lost all memory of Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean palaces, but when trade with the Near East revived, they encountered the Phoenician alphabet, a flexible writing system that used a small number of symbols to represent sounds. The Greeks adapted it, adding vowels, something no writing system had ever done so clearly before. This innovation made Greek writing uniquely accessible and powerful. With it, law, poetry, trade records, and stories could finally be written again. The earliest inscriptions appear on pottery, metal objects, and simple markers. Some are humorous, others are personal. One of the oldest, found on a drinking cup from Pitakusai, reads, "Whoever of all dancers now plays most delicately, to him this, a playful message from a world rediscovering its voice." From these humble beginnings, literacy spread gradually, first among elites and craftsmen, then more broadly across communities. But writing alone did not define this new era. At the same time, something even more transformative was taking shape: the emergence of the Polis, the Greek city-state. A polis was more than a city. It was a community, a shared identity, a place where people gathered to discuss matters that affected everyone. At the center of each polis was the agora, an open space used for markets, meetings, and civic life. Around it rose homes, workshops, temples, and, in some places, early forms of public buildings. The polis was both physical and philosophical, a new way of organising human society. Across Greece, hundreds of polis began to form. Some were small, little more than clusters of homes on a hill. Others grew into powerful cities with walls, fleets, and influence. Each polis developed its own laws, customs, festivals, and political systems. These differences would eventually lead to rivalry, but they also fostered extraordinary diversity and creativity. The rise of the polis also brought changes in leadership. Kings, once common in the Dark Age, gradually lost authority. Aristocratic families took their place, forming councils of elders who advised and governed. These families controlled land, wealth, and military power. Over time, tensions grew between them and the common people, farmers, craftsmen, and traders, who sought greater roles in public life. The Greeks also began to look outward again. Population growth, limited farmland, and political pressures led many communities to send settlers abroad. From around 750 to 650 BCE, Greeks founded colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. They settled in southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, Thrace, and along the coast of Anatolia. These colonies were independent but maintained cultural and religious ties to their mother cities. They spread Greek language, art, and trade networks far beyond the Aegean. With this expansion came new wealth. Merchants exchanged pottery, wine, olive oil, textiles, and metal goods. In return, they brought timber, grain, silver, tin, and luxury items. This economic growth supported artisans who refined pottery styles into elegant geometric and later orientalizing forms. Black figure and red figure pottery would soon follow, marking the height of Greek ceramic art. Religion also evolved during this time. Sanctuaries grew into complex sites of worship. Delphi, Olympia, Delos, and Dodona became pan-Hellenic centers, places where Greeks from distant cities could gather, compete, consult oracles, and honor the gods. These shared traditions fostered a sense of cultural unity, even as individual polis developed distinct identities. The Archaic Age also witnessed the first stirrings of political reform. As tensions mounted between aristocrats and common citizens, some cities experimented with new forms of governance. Lawgivers, such as Draco and Solon in Athens, began codifying laws to reduce arbitrary decisions by nobles. In other cities, tyrants, not tyrants in the modern sense, but strongmen who seized power, emerged to challenge aristocratic rule. Many tyrants were popular at first, supporting public works, festivals, and economic reforms. Despite differences across regions, one thing was becoming clear. Greece was no longer a land of scattered villages. It was becoming a land of cities, each with its own character, pride, and ambition. As the polis matured, two of the most influential cities began to stand apart, one known for discipline, order, and military strength, the other for debate, creativity, and the seeds of democracy. The first was Sparta, and its story began long before the world knew its name. In the southern Peloponnese, beyond rugged mountains and quiet valleys, lies Laconia, a land shaped by the slow flow of the Eurotas River and watched over by the high ridges of Mount Taygetus. It was here that Sparta emerged, one of the most unusual societies the ancient world would ever know. While other Greek cities turned toward trade, art, and lively public debate, Sparta gradually chose a different path. It became a community organized almost entirely around discipline, obedience, and war. To the outside world, it seemed severe and strange. To the Spartans themselves, it was simply the only way to survive. In the early Archaic Age, small Dorian settlements occupied the plain of Laconia. Over time, several neighbouring villages, Pitane, Messoa, Limnae, Kinosura, and later Amyclae, merged into a single political unit. This union formed the basis of what would become Sparta. Unlike many other Greek polis, Sparta never developed a grand, crowded urban centre. Its settlements were spread out, more like a cluster of communities than a single compact city. Sparta's transformation began in earnest when it turned its attention outward. The land around the Eurotas was fertile but limited. Beyond it lay Messenia, a region of rich fields and gentle hills to the west. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Spartans waged the Mycenaean Wars, long, difficult conflicts that ended in Spartan victory. But instead of absorbing the Messenians as equal citizens or pushing them away, Sparta did something different. It turned them into helots. Helots were not slaves in the usual sense, bought and sold in markets. They were a conquered population, bound to the land and forced to farm it for their Spartan overlords. They worked the fields, raised crops, and produced the food that supported the entire Spartan system. In exchange, they retained a limited degree of community life, but lived under constant fear and strict control. This arrangement made Sparta strong and vulnerable at the same time. The helots greatly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. Any sign of weakness, any crack in the system, could invite rebellion. This ever-present threat would shape nearly every aspect of Spartan society. To maintain control, the Spartans felt they had to harden themselves, to live with constant readiness, to become soldiers first and everything else second. Tradition credits this reorganization of Spartan life to a shadowy figure named Lycurgus. Whether he was a real lawgiver or a legendary symbol of change, the reforms associated with his name reshaped Sparta completely. The laws, called the Great Retra, were said to have come from the oracle at Delphi and given to Sparta as a kind of sacred blueprint for life. One of the most important creations of this system was the Aegoge, the rigorous education and training program for Spartan boys. At the age of 7, sons of Spartan citizens left their homes and entered communal barracks. From that point on, they belonged more to the state than to their families. The Aegoge taught boys to endure cold, hunger, and hardship. They went barefoot much of the time and wore a single cloak throughout the year, even in winter. Their food was simple and sometimes deliberately scarce, forcing them to learn resourcefulness. If they stole food and were caught, they were punished not for stealing, but for being careless enough to be discovered. Training focused on physical strength, endurance, and combat skill. Running, wrestling, spearwork, and coordinated drills. But it was also a school of character boys learned to speak briefly and directly, giving rise to the famous laconic style. Wit, courage, and self-control were prized. They were encouraged to sing in chorus, learn traditional songs, and perform ritual dances, blending toughness with shared culture. At 20, a young Spartan man could become a full soldier, but citizenship was not automatic. He had to be accepted into a common mess group, a syssition, where citizens dined together each evening. Membership in these groups was essential. They were the heart of Spartan social life, places where bonds between soldiers were forged and maintained. Only those accepted and able to contribute to the shared meals could fully belong to the community of equals. Spartan society was divided into distinct groups. At the top were the Spartiates, the full citizens, men who had completed the Aegoge, held land worked by helots, and participated in the assembly. Below them were the Perioikoi, or those who live around. These were free inhabitants of surrounding towns who handled trade, crafts, and some military duties, but did not enjoy full citizen rights. At the bottom were the helots, bound to the land, essential to the economy, and yet constantly watched. To keep helot populations under control, the Spartans employed harsh measures. One of the most chilling was the crypteia. a secretive institution in which young Spartan men were sent into the countryside with minimal equipment, encouraged to live off the land and, according to some ancient accounts, to target potential helot leaders or troublemakers. Whether all details of these stories are accurate or not, they reflect the depth of fear and control embedded in Sparta's relationship with its subject population. Spartan women lived under a different system than women elsewhere in Greece. While they did not serve as soldiers, they underwent physical training, running and exercising to keep strong and healthy. They managed households and estates in the absence of their husbands, who spent most of their time in barracks even after marriage. Unlike many Greek women, Spartan women could own land and were known for speaking their minds. Ancient authors often remark on their boldness, their pride, and the sharp, concise sayings attributed to them. Politically, Sparta balanced several forms of rule. It had two kings, each from a different royal house, the Aegeads and the Eurypontids. These kings led armies in war and performed religious rites, but did not rule alone. The Gerousia, a council of 28 elders, over the age of 60, plus the two kings, debated major proposals and served as a high court. The Ephors, 5 officials elected annually, held significant power over daily governance, even over the kings themselves. Finally, the Apella, the assembly of Spartan male citizens, could approve or reject proposals, though its power was more limited than the assemblies of other Greek polis. The result was a system that prized stability above all. Change was slow. Foreign influence was restricted. Spartans were discouraged from travelling abroad, and foreigners were not always welcome within their borders. Coinage was said to have been deliberately kept heavy and impractical to prevent the accumulation of wealth and luxury. Whether or not every detail of these accounts is accurate, they reflect how the Greeks understood Sparta, a place that traded comfort for unity and individuality for discipline. In war, the Spartans developed one of the most effective fighting forces in the Greek world. The core of their army was the hoplite, a heavily armed infantry soldier who fought in a tight formation called the phalanx. Hoplites wore helmets, breastplates, greaves, and carried a large round shield, a spear, and often a short sword. In battle, they stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, advancing as a single wall of bronze and wood. For Sparta, the phalanx was not just a tactic, it was an expression of their society. Each man's safety depended on the discipline of the man beside him. No one could hold the line alone. Training in the agoge prepared Spartans to trust one another completely, to move as one body, and to hold their position even under terrible pressure. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Sparta had become a dominant power in the Peloponnese. Through alliances and influence, it led a network of states known as the Peloponnesian League. Other cities joined this league and looked to Sparta for military leadership and stability. Spartan soldiers became a symbol of reliability and fear, feared by enemies, trusted by allies. Yet beneath this strength lay fragility. The system that made Sparta powerful also made it inflexible. Its citizen population remained relatively small and slowly declined over time. The constant need to keep the helots subdued prevented Sparta from changing easily or embracing new ideas. Art, philosophy, and trade, which blossomed elsewhere, remained secondary in Spartan life. Still, in this period before the great conflicts of the 5th century BCE, Sparta stood as a quiet, disciplined force. Its fields yielded grain through the labour of helots. Its youths trained in the agoge. Its kings and elders guarded tradition, and its warriors prepared for the next call to battle. While Sparta honed its strength in the south, another city to the north was following a very different path. It welcomed traders and craftsmen, embraced new ideas, and began to experiment with radical political reforms. That city was Athens. And its journey from kings and aristocrats to the first steps of democracy would reshape the story of Greece and much of the world in the centuries to come. In the rugged landscape of Attica, where rocky hills rise gently from the earth and the sea spreads out in a quiet blue arc, a city slowly took shape that would one day reshape the intellectual and political map of the ancient world. Unlike Sparta, whose strength grew from the silence of its valleys and the discipline of its warriors, Athens developed through debate, experimentation, and the restless energy of people living close together in a city that never stopped changing. Athens' story began in deep antiquity, long before written history could record its earliest kings. Legends speak of heroes like Cecrops, half man, half serpent, of Erechtheus, born from the earth itself, and of Theseus, the unifier of Attica, who defeated bandits, challenged kings, and symbolically tamed the chaos of the early land. These tales are woven from myth, memory, and identity. Whether the kings themselves lived as described is uncertain, but what matters is that the Athenians believed their city was ancient, noble, and rooted in the very soil of their homeland. By the early Archaic Age, Athens was no longer ruled by kings. Power had shifted to the aristocratic families known as the Eupatrids, the well-born. These families controlled land, made laws, judged disputes, and filled the offices that guided the city. Their council, the Areopagus, met on the rocky hill west of the Acropolis. From this high place, they watched over the city that lay below like a patchwork of homes, sanctuaries, workshops, and marketplaces. But as the population grew, so did inequality. Small farmers struggled to work the thin Attic soil, often borrowing seed or tools from aristocrats. When harvests failed or debts mounted, farmers risked losing not just their land, but their freedom. Some were forced into debt bondage, working as serfs on land they once owned. Others were sold abroad. Families were torn apart by obligations they could not escape. By the 7th century BCE, these tensions threatened the fabric of Athenian society. Violence loomed. Many feared that the city would be torn apart by class conflict, a future of unrest and revenge. To prevent collapse, the Athenians appointed a man named Draco to write down the city's first formal law code. Draco's laws, carved into wooden tablets and displayed publicly, were meant to bring clarity and order, but they were notoriously harsh. Many minor offences carried the death penalty. The word draconian still echoes this severity. While Draco succeeded in giving written form to the law, he did little to ease the suffering of the poor. The crisis deepened. Athens needed not just clarity, but wisdom. Someone who could see beyond wealth and birth. Someone who understood that law should bind a city together, not tear it apart. That man was Solon. Appointed around 594 BCE as archon and lawgiver, Solon embarked on a series of reforms that reshaped Athenian society. His measures were broad and compassionate. He abolished debt slavery, freeing those who had been sold abroad and cancelling the crushing bonds that had trapped so many. He reorganized political participation based on wealth rather than birth, allowing prosperous farmers and craftsmen a voice in public affairs. He encouraged trade, standardized weights, and promoted the planting of olive trees, which would become a cornerstone of Athenian economy. Solon also invited Athenians to participate more actively in law. He created courts in which ordinary citizens could appeal decisions, planting the early seeds of civic involvement. His poetry reveals a man who understood the delicate balance of society, that equality was not the same as sameness, and that justice required restraint from both rich and poor. But Solon could not solve every problem. Some felt he went too far, others believed he had not gone far enough. After he left Athens to travel abroad, seeking to avoid pressure from every faction, the city drifted back into turmoil. Over the next few decades, power struggles intensified, culminating in the rise of a man who would reshape Athens once more. Peisistratos. Peisistratos was a charismatic aristocrat who seized power and became a tyrant, a word that originally meant sole ruler, not necessarily a cruel one. His rule, surprisingly, brought stability. He supported farmers with loans, expanded trade, and beautified the city with new temples and public works. He promoted festivals such as the Panathenaea, strengthening Athenian identity. Under his rule, Athens began to flourish economically and culturally. After his death, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus continued his rule. But political pressure and internal tensions eventually toppled the tyranny. Hippias became increasingly paranoid and oppressive after his brother's assassination, and by 510 BCE, he was expelled from the city with the help of Sparta. Athens now faced a critical question. What kind of government should replace the tyrants? The answer came from Cleisthenes, a nobleman with a bold vision. In 508/507 BCE, he enacted reforms that reorganized Athenian society into demes, local districts that mixed citizens from different regions and backgrounds. He broke the power of old aristocratic clans and created a system in which citizens participated directly through the ecclesia, the assembly. This was the beginning of Athenian democracy. Not democracy as we know it today, but a radical experiment in citizen rule. Any male citizen could speak in the assembly, propose laws, and vote on matters of war, and policy councils were selected by lot to prevent corruption. Magistrates were held accountable by the people. Power was distributed broadly, and debate became the heartbeat of Athenian life. Athens did not become a perfect society. Women, slaves, metics, resident foreigners, and many others had no political rights, but for its time, it was revolutionary. Decisions were made not by kings or nobles alone, but by ordinary citizens who felt responsible for the fate of their city. As the 6th century BCE drew to a close, Athens stood transformed. It had emerged from aristocratic rule, debt crisis, tyranny, and political struggle to create something the world had never seen before. A city where arguments, persuasion, and public speech mattered more than lineage or wealth. And soon, this new model of civic life would be tested, not by internal conflict, but by a threat from beyond the horizon. A vast empire gathering in the east, preparing to challenge the freedom of every Greek city. The Persian Empire was coming, and Athens was about to discover what it truly meant to be a city of citizens. By the time Athens was taking its first steps toward democracy, and Sparta had settled into its hard, disciplined rhythm, the Greek world as a whole was already bound together by something older and deeper than laws or alliances. It was bound by stories. Across mountains, islands, and coasts, people woke under different skies, spoke in different dialects, and lived under different governments. Yet they shared the same tales of gods and heroes, the same sacred places, and the same sense that the divine was never far away. In the wind, in the sea, in the crackling of a hearth fire, or in the quiet shade of an olive tree. Religion in ancient Greece was not a distant system of doctrines. It was woven into the everyday rhythm of life. At the center of this world stood the Olympian gods, a family of powerful, unpredictable beings who lived in imagination on the snowy peak of Mount Olympus. Zeus, the king of the gods, ruled the sky with thunderbolt in hand, guarding oaths and justice. Hera watched over marriage and the dignity of wives. Athena, grey-eyed and thoughtful, embodied wisdom, craft, and strategic war. Apollo presided over music, light, and prophecy. Artemis roamed the wild places. Poseidon shook the earth and stirred the seas. Demeter watched the cycle of crops. Aphrodite governed desire and attraction. Ares revelled in the chaos of battle. Hephaestus forged in fire. Hermes moved swiftly between worlds. These gods were not perfect or distant. They quarreled, loved, deceived, and favored cities or individuals. They felt close because they behaved in many ways like magnified humans, powerful but not unreachable. A farmer in Arcadia, a sailor in Corinth, or a potter in Athens could feel that their own struggles, joys, and missteps were reflected in the divine stories sung by poets. Temples rose to the gods in places where their presence was believed to be especially strong. On hilltops, in clearings, near springs of pure water, communities built simple altars first, and later more elaborate structures of stone. These temples were not churches in the modern sense, filled with congregations each week. Their inner rooms were reserved for sacred statues and offerings. Worship happened mostly outside, under open sky, where incense smoke drifted upward and the smell of burnt sacrifice mixed with the air. Religious festivals marked the calendar, turning ordinary time into sacred time. In Athens, the Panathenaea honoured Athena with processions, sacrifices, athletic contests, and music. Men and women walked together up to the Acropolis carrying woven garments, peploi, as offerings. In Olympia, athletes from all over Greece gathered for the Olympic Games, running, wrestling, and driving chariots to honour Zeus. For the duration of these games, truces were declared, and enemies could stand side by side, united by ritual and competition. These gatherings did more than please the gods. They reminded the Greeks that despite political rivalries, they shared something larger, a common culture and a common story. Sacrifice was at the heart of worship. At dawn, animals, often sheep or cattle, were led to the altar, adorned with ribbons. Grain and wine were sprinkled, prayers were spoken, and the animal was killed in a solemn, structured act. The gods received the smoke in certain parts. The people shared the roasted meat. Religion was not separate from celebration. It was present in the shared meal, the songs, the wine cups passed around, and the sense of belonging that came from honouring the gods together. Alongside the great temples and festivals, there was the more intimate world of household religion. Each home had its own hearth, watched over by Hestia, goddess of the fire. At this central place, families offered bits of food or wine, whispered thanks, and sought protection. Small shrines in courtyards, doorways, or near fields honoured local heroes or lesser gods. Before journeys, sacrifices were made. Before planting, prayers were offered. Religion was a constant quiet presence, as natural as breathing. The Greeks also believed that certain places acted as direct channels to the divine, places where the veil between mortal and God seemed thin. The most famous of these was Delphi, where Apollo's oracle spoke. Pilgrims walked or sailed from distant corners of the Greek world, climbing the sacred slope to ask questions about war, colonization, law, or personal worries. The priestess, the Pythia, seated over a chasm, delivered answers in ecstatic utterances, which priests then shaped into poetic responses. These oracles were rarely simple. They spoke in riddles, reflecting a deep belief that the future was not fixed in straightforward lines. Interpretation required wisdom. The uncertainty itself taught the Greeks something important. The gods might guide, but mortals had to decide. Beneath all of this, the temples, the sacrifices, the oracles, flowed a great river of myth. Myths were not just stories for children. They were the shared memory of a people, explaining how the world came to be, why suffering exists, what happens when a person grows too proud or defies the natural order. There were tales of creation, of the Titans and their overthrow by Zeus, stories of Prometheus, who stole fire for humanity and suffered for his boldness, the strange and moving journey of Persephone, whose descent into and return from the underworld explained the coming and going of the seasons, the tragic loves of Orpheus and Eurydice, the labours of Heracles, the voyages of Jason and the Argonauts, the cleverness of Odysseus. These myths did not belong to one city alone. They belonged to everyone. A potter painting a vase in Corinth could depict scenes from the Iliad. A sculptor in a distant island sanctuary might carve a hero he had heard about in songs learned as a child. Mythical stories were sung at feasts, recited during festivals, and woven into everyday objects: cups, jars, jewellery, and murals. Through them, the Greeks explored love, jealousy, bravery, folly, and the limits of human power. Behind the great public events and famous myths lay the quieter, steady rhythm of daily life. Most Greeks, whether in Athens, Sparta, or smaller Polis, lived close to the land. Dawn came early. Farmers walked out into fields of barley and wheat, or tended olives and vines on stony terraces. They pruned trees, guided ploughs pulled by oxen, and watched the sky for signs of weather. Goats and sheep grazed on hillsides, bells clinking softly as they moved. The year turned around the patterns of sowing and harvest, of cutting grapes and pressing olives. In towns and cities, craftsmen worked in small workshops that opened onto the street. Potters shaped clay at spinning wheels. Blacksmiths hammered red-hot metal into tools and weapons. Carpenters carved beams and furniture. There were cobblers, sculptors, painters, and builders. Apprentices learned by watching and doing, slowly absorbing skills that had been passed down through generations. Market days filled the agora, the central space of the polis. Stalls offered fish, bread, vegetables, oil, wine, and simple goods. Voices mingled in the air, buyers haggling over prices, news travelling from traveller to listener, children weaving between adults' legs. The agora was not only a marketplace, it was a place of conversation, rumour, and politics, where men debated public matters informally, long before they stood in the assemblies. Inside homes, life unfolded at a slower, more sheltered pace. Houses were often built around a central courtyard, a bright open space where much of daily life took place. Women oversaw the spinning of wool, weaving of cloth, preparation of food, and care of children. They managed stores, arranged marriages, and maintained household shrines. In many polis, their worlds were more confined than men's, but within that domestic sphere, they were the anchors of continuity. Children played with simple toys, dolls, small carts, carved animals, knucklebones used as dice. They learned songs, stories, and basic skills from parents and elders. Boys would eventually move more into the public life of the city, especially in places like Athens, where they might train in athletics, music, and rhetoric. Girls were prepared for roles within the household, though the specifics varied from city to city. In the evenings, men gathered for symposia, drinking parties, especially in the cities. Reclining on couches, they shared wine mixed with water, listened to music, recited poetry, and engaged in philosophical or political discussion. These gatherings were formal and ritualized, guided by a symposiarch who decided the pace of drinking. Songs and conversation flowed late into the night. Ideas were tested, friendships strengthened, and reputations made. Not everyone in this world enjoyed the same freedom. Slaves were a part of everyday life, present in homes, fields, workshops, and mines. Some had been captured in war or born into servitude. They cooked, cleaned, carried water, worked the land, and assisted in trade. Their presence was so common that most free Greeks rarely questioned the system that supported their own leisure and political participation. The foundations of Greek culture, including some of its greatest achievements, rested on this quiet, unseen labour. And yet, Despite the inequalities, uncertainties, and hardships, there was a shared sense that life was connected to the land, to the community, and to the unseen world of gods and ancestors. A festival, a shared meal after sacrifice, a song sung in harmony. All of these reminded people that they were part of something larger than themselves. Religion, myth, and daily life were not separate categories. They blended together like colours in fading sunlight. To plant a field was to trust in Demeter. To launch a ship was to place hope in Poseidon. To speak in the assembly was to swear by Zeus and Athena. To tell a story of Heracles or Odysseus was to rehearse the patterns of courage and failure that shaped human existence. As the Archaic Age unfolded, this interconnected world of belief and routine provided a stable backdrop for the great changes to come. For while farmers worked their fields and families tended their hearths, powerful forces were gathering beyond the Aegean. A vast empire was watching from the east, and the Greek cities, with all their gods, customs, and stories, would soon be tested by war on a scale they had never known. The stage was set for the Persian Wars, and in that coming storm, the character of Greece, forged in myth, ritual, and the simple rhythm of daily life, would reveal itself to the world. Long before the first Persian soldier set foot on Greek soil, the conflict that would define an era began quietly. Far from the Greek mainland, it started in the eastern Aegean, where Greek-speaking cities dotted the coast of Asia Minor, places like Miletus, Ephesus, and Smyrna. These communities, known as the Ionian Greeks, were separated from the rest of Greece by the sea, yet shared its language, customs, and gods. For generations they had flourished, trading with the Near East and Egypt, building temples and markets, and shaping the early intellectual currents of the Greek world. But as the 6th century BCE unfolded, a new power rose in the east, vast, wealthy, and unlike anything the Greeks had known before. This was the Persian Empire, forged by Cyrus the Great and expanded by his successors. It stretched from Egypt to India, uniting millions of people under a single rule. When the Persians extended their influence across Anatolia, the Ionian cities became their subjects. At first, Persian rule was not harsh. Local tyrants governed the cities, supported by Persian oversight. But under the surface, resentment simmered. Aristocrats worried about losing influence. Ordinary citizens disliked the foreign-backed tyrants, and merchants feared unpredictable shifts in trade. These tensions grew slowly, pressure accumulating like water behind a dam. In 499 BCE, the dam broke. The Ionian city of Miletus, led by its ambitious tyrant Aristagoras, sparked a revolt against Persian control. What began as a local uprising soon spread across the coast and into nearby islands. The Ionians sought help from mainland Greece. Most Polis refused. Persia was too large, too distant, too formidable. But two cities stepped forward, almost impulsively: Athens and Eretria. The Athenians sent ships across the sea. Eretria sent a smaller force. Together with the rebels, they marched inland and set fire to Sardis, a Persian administrative centre. The flames rose high, consuming buildings and warehouses. Though the Greeks eventually retreated, the message was unmistakable. The smallest of the Greek cities had dared to strike at the greatest power in the world. News of the burning of Sardis reached the Persian king Darius I. According to legend, he ordered a servant to whisper to him at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether true or not, the image captures his determination. The Persian Empire would not tolerate defiance. The cities of Ionia were crushed, the revolt was extinguished. But Persia's anger now pointed westward. In 490 BCE, the first Persian expedition crossed the Aegean. It moved methodically from island to island, Compelling submission or inflicting punishment, Eretria was captured and burned, its people taken into exile. The Persian army then sailed across the narrow strait to the plain of Marathon, only a day's march from Athens. Marathon was a broad, open field, framed by mountains and sea, a place where the fate of Athens, perhaps even of Greece, hung in the balance. The Athenians, vastly outnumbered, positioned themselves at the edge of the plain. Instead of waiting to be overwhelmed, they made a bold, unexpected decision. They charged. The sight must have been astonishing. A small Greek army running across the plain in tight formation, shields held forward, spears levelled. The Persians, more accustomed to archers and cavalry, were shaken by the sudden impact. For hours the battle raged, dust rising, shields clashing, shouts echoing. When it ended, the Athenians had driven the Persians back to their ships. It was a victory so unlikely that it spread across the Greek world like a spark in dry grass. But victory did not end the danger. Darius prepared a far greater invasion, one meant not to punish, but to conquer. Before he could launch it, he died. His son Xerxes inherited the throne and the ambition. For years he gathered soldiers, built supply lines, and constructed bridges of boats across the Hellespont. Ancient sources describe an enormous army, though the exact numbers are debated. What mattered was not the count, but the scale. This was the largest force Greeks had ever imagined, advancing toward them like a slow-moving storm. In 480 BCE, Xerxes' army moved into Greece. Cities across the mainland debated what to do. Some submitted, others hesitated. But a group of Polis formed an alliance known as the Hellenic League, led by Sparta on land and Athens at sea. The first test came at Thermopylae, the narrow pass known as the Hot Gates. There, the Spartan king Leonidas and a small force, including his famed 300 Spartans, held the pass against the massive Persian army. They fought not for victory, which was impossible, but to buy time for Greece. For 3 days they held the line, their formation blocking the narrow gap between mountain and sea. Their resistance became legend. When they fell to betrayal, surrounded by Persians who had been led through a secret path behind the pass. With Thermopylae lost, the Persians marched south. Athens was evacuated. Its people boarded ships and fled to nearby islands and coasts. Xerxes entered the city, burned the temples on the Acropolis, and watched flames rise into the sky. But Athens was not defeated. Its strength was now at sea. In the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the mainland, the Greek fleet waited. The Persians expected an easy victory. Their fleet was larger, more numerous, but the tight waters favoured the Greeks. They knew every current, every shift of wind. Their ships, triremes, were lighter, built for speed and manoeuvre. The battle began as the morning sun rose. Greek ships surged forward, striking the heavier Persian vessels with bronze rams. Rowers pulled in rhythm, guided by drums and shouted commands. The narrow strait filled with shattered wood and bodies. Smoke drifted across the water. By the time the sun reached its height, the Persian fleet was in disarray. Victory belonged to the Greeks. Salamis marked the turning point. Xerxes retreated with part of his army. The next year, in 479 BCE, Greek forces under Spartan leadership defeated the remaining Persian land troops at Plataea, while the Greek navy won another crucial victory at Mycale. The Persian threat was broken. Greece remained free. In the aftermath, Athens assumed leadership of the newly formed Delian League, a naval alliance meant to continue the struggle against Persia and protect the Aegean over time. This league became the foundation of Athenian power and wealth. Tribute flowed into the city. Trade expanded. Art, architecture, and philosophy flourished. But the story of the Persian Wars was not only one of battles. It was a story about identity, about small city-states realizing they could stand together against overwhelming force. It was a story of courage in the face of fear, of sacrifice at Thermopylae, of boldness at Marathon, of strategy at Salamis. It was also a story of choices. Athens choosing the sea, Sparta choosing the land, cities choosing independence over empire, ordinary people choosing to defend their homes. For the Greeks, these wars became a defining memory. They showed that freedom was worth defending, even when the odds were impossible. The victories did not unite Greece forever. Far from it, rivalries would soon return and new conflicts would rise. But for one brief moment, the Greek world stood as one. And in the years that followed, that unity would give birth to something extraordinary, the Golden Age of Athens. When the dust of the Persian Wars finally settled, Athens stood at the edge of a transformation unlike anything Greece had seen before. Cities rebuilt, fields were sown again, ships repaired, but something in the spirit of the Athenians had changed. They had tasted fear, exile, loss, and triumph. They had seen their homes burned, then reclaimed the sea with boldness and clarity. And with victory came confidence, the belief that their city could become something greater than refuge or fortress. From this moment grew the Golden Age of Athens, a period not defined by wealth alone, but by imagination, ambition, and a restless desire to shape the world through ideas, beauty, and human expression. In the years following the wars, Athens assumed leadership of the Delian League, a naval alliance formed to defend Greece and continue pressure on Persia. Each member city contributed ships or money, stored originally on the sacred island of Delos. Over time, contributions shifted from ships to silver. This silver flowed steadily into Athens, strengthening its fleet, expanding its port at Piraeus, and funding civic projects. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the League transformed from a shared defense pact into something closer to an empire. Not all cities appreciated this transformation. Some tried to leave the League and were brought back by force. Others stayed reluctantly, paying tribute while watching Athens grow richer and more confident each year. But for the Athenians themselves, the wealth meant possibility, the chance to craft their city in stone and marble, to honor their gods, and to express their view of the world through art and architecture. At the center of this transformation stood Pericles, a statesman whose calm voice and steady vision guided Athens for decades. Under his leadership, the Athenians embarked on one of the most ambitious building programs the ancient world had ever seen. On the rocky hill of the Acropolis, artisans, sculptors, architects, and laborers worked together to rebuild what the Persians had destroyed, not as it had been, but as a symbol of the city's new spirit. Slowly, rising from the limestone bedrock, the Parthenon took shape. Massive Doric columns lined its sides. Marble blocks, quarried from Mount Pentelicon, gleamed white under the sun inside. A towering statue of Athena, crafted from gold and ivory, stood with shield and spear, watching over her city. The building was a temple, but also a statement, a declaration that Athens was not merely a survivor of war, but a creator of beauty and order. Around the Parthenon rose other structures, the Propylaea, a monumental gateway, the Temple of Athena Nike celebrating victory, and the Erechtheion, with its haunting porch of the Caryatids. Female figures carved as columns, bearing the weight of stone with effortless grace. The Acropolis became a place where religion, art, memory, and civic pride merged into a single vision. But the Golden Age of Athens was not built on architecture alone. It was a time when minds opened and ideas moved through the city, like a breeze carrying the scent of new blossoms. The Agora, Athens' central gathering place, became a living classroom where citizens discussed politics, philosophy, trade, and the affairs of the day. Merchants called out prices. Philosophers argued under shaded stowers. Travellers brought news from distant lands: Egypt, the Black Sea, Sicily, Persia. Athens became a city of voices, disciplined, loud, argumentative, curious. Democracy, still evolving, allowed citizens to gather in the assembly, where they debated war, taxes, law, and public projects. Anyone could speak if he had the courage to climb the bema and address the thousands gathered. Some speeches were hesitant, others were masterful. But through argument and persuasion, decisions were made collectively, creating a political life unlike anything else in the ancient world. This openness extended to the arts. Tragedy and comedy blossomed during this time, performed at festivals honouring Dionysus. Playwrights used the stage to explore the deepest questions of human experience: fate, justice, pride, revenge, and the fragile balance between mortal choices and divine forces. Aeschylus, one of the earliest tragedians, had fought at Marathon and Salamis. His plays carried the weight of those battles, filled with grandeur and moral struggle. Sophocles, whose calm dignity matched the city's ideals, wrote tragedies that explored human resilience and the limits of wisdom. Euripides, more rebellious, examined the darker corners of emotion: jealousy, love, madness, challenging audiences to face uncomfortable truths. In comedy, writers like Aristophanes used humour to critique politics, society, and war. Through laughter, Athenians confronted their own flaws. Philosophy and science also took root. The sophists questioned assumptions and taught rhetoric. Thinkers studied astronomy, mathematics, and the nature of the universe. Questions that had once been left to myth were examined through reason. What is justice? What is virtue? What is the good life? These questions were debated in the streets, in homes, and in symposiums where wine flowed and ideas blossomed late into the night. One figure in particular began to walk barefoot through the city, stopping to ask questions of anyone who would speak with him. This was Socrates, a man who believed that wisdom began with acknowledging one's own ignorance. He talked with craftsmen, politicians, soldiers, and young students, leading them through conversations that revealed contradictions and deeper truths. His method was simple but powerful. He asked why, and he kept asking until the person standing before him had either reached clarity or walked away in frustration. As Athens flourished, daily life grew more complex. New temples, fountains, and roads appeared. Markets bustled with goods from across the Mediterranean. Fish, olives, wine, spices, incense, pottery, bronze, and silver. Ships filled the harbour of Piraeus, carrying cargo and travellers. Athenians enjoyed festivals almost every month, each with its own rituals, plays, athletic contests, and feasts. Music, poetry, and dance filled the air. Yet beneath the brightness, Athens carried shadows. Its democracy excluded women, metics, and slaves. The wealth that funded its monuments depended partly on tribute from reluctant allies and on silver mined under harsh conditions at Lorient. The confidence that fueled artistic and political daring could easily slip into arrogance and overreach. And while Athens celebrated freedom, it sometimes imposed its will on others with a heavy hand. Still, for a generation, the city glowed with extraordinary vitality. Travellers from other Greek polis and from foreign lands walked its streets and marvelled at its buildings, its energy, its culture. They heard debates in the agora, watched plays in the theatre, and saw the sunlight gleam on the Parthenon's marble. It was said that to be born in Athens during this time was to live in the centre of a new world, a world that valued not only survival, but also beauty, thought, and the search for meaning. But nothing in Greece stayed still for long. Rivalries simmered just beneath the surface. While Athens was rising, Sparta watched. wary of its growing influence. The Delian League looked less like an alliance and more like an empire. The ambitions of one city began to clash with the pride of another. And soon, the two greatest powers of Greece would find themselves drawn into a conflict that would shake the foundations of the Greek world. The Golden Age of Athens shone brightly, but its brilliant light cast long shadows. Those shadows would fall fully in the coming conflict. The Peloponnesian War was approaching. The Golden Age of Athens brought beauty, innovation, and confidence, but also something more fragile: imbalance. While Athens expanded its influence across the Aegean, building temples of marble and fleets of shining triremes, another great power watched from the southern Peloponnese. Sparta, disciplined, conservative, and wary of change, saw Athens not as a cultural wonder, but as a rising threat. To the Spartans, Athens' expanding empire looked dangerous. To the Athenians, Sparta's military strength and strict order seemed equally troubling. Between these two great powers lay dozens of smaller city-states, some leaning toward one side, some toward the other, all caught in the brewing tension. The Peloponnesian War did not begin with a single spark, but with decades of rivalry, mistrust, and small disputes that slowly tightened like knots in a rope trade conflicts. Border quarrels, fears of encirclement, arguments between allies. Each incident added weight, pressing Greece closer to a war no one could easily escape. In 431 BCE, the tension broke. Corinth, a powerful city allied with Sparta, had clashed repeatedly with Athens. When Athens supported Corcyra against Corinth, the situation worsened. Soon after, a dispute in Potidaea drew Athens deeper into conflict. Megara, another city, complained of harsh Athenian trade restrictions. One by one, the strands pulled together until a web of grievances stretched across Greece. Sparta's allies demanded action. The Spartans, reluctant at first, eventually agreed. Athens had become too powerful. The balance had shifted too far. A war was declared. Not a quick battle, but a conflict that would span a generation and transform Greece forever. At the war's beginning, Athens followed the strategy of Pericles. He knew Athens could not match Sparta's land army. Instead, he advised Athenians to gather behind the city's long walls, rely on their navy, and strike where Sparta was weak. Let Sparta burn the countryside, he argued. Athens' true wealth was the sea. For a time, this strategy worked. Spartan forces marched into Attica each year, burning farmlands and olive groves, while Athenian citizens watched from behind the city walls. But what Pericles did not foresee was the toll of overcrowding. Refugees poured into the city. Homes became cramped, streets filled with noise and waste. The heat of summer baked the stone walls, and disease began to spread. Then came the plague. No ancient source describes it precisely enough to identify it today, but its devastation is unmistakable. Fever, chills, sores, exhaustion, entire families struck down. In the tightly packed city, illness moved faster than anyone could react. Thousands died. Priests, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers. No one was safe. Even Pericles, the leader who had guided Athens through triumph and crisis, succumbed to the disease. The plague changed the mood of Athens. Confidence turned to fear. Order gave way to desperation. Ceremonies faltered. Laws were ignored. The city that once celebrated its democracy now struggled simply to endure. It was a moment when the brilliance of Athens dimmed, revealing the fragility beneath its marble and ideals. Yet, the war continued. For more than a decade, neither side could secure a lasting victory. Athens raided the Peloponnese by sea. Sparta ravaged Attica by land. The Greek world divided sharply, husband against husband, brother against brother, in cities where loyalties split, some Polis switched sides repeatedly, trying to survive the shifting fortunes of war. In 421 BCE, after years of bloodshed, both sides agreed to a fragile truce, the Peace of Nicias. It offered a moment of relief, a chance for rebuilding, a hope that the conflict might cool. But the peace was uneasy, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. Alliances shifted again, arguments flared, and the war resumed. Then came one of the most ambitious and disastrous decisions in Athenian history. In 415 BCE, driven by a mixture of opportunity, ambition, and political persuasion, Athens launched the Sicilian expedition. The plan was daring: to sail across the sea, conquer the wealthy city of Syracuse, and expand Athenian influence into the Western Mediterranean. It was a vision of empire stretching beyond imagination. A massive fleet assembled at Piraeus, triremes polished, sails bundled, rowers ready. Citizens lined the harbour, watching as the ships set out, shimmering in the light. It was one of the largest naval forces Athens had ever sent abroad. Spirits were high. Songs were sung. Many believed victory was inevitable. But Sicily was far from home, and Syracuse was stronger than Athens had expected. The generals quarrelled, supplies faltered, Spartan advisors aided the Syracusans. The Athenians, trapped in unfamiliar terrain, began to lose ground. When reinforcements arrived, they came too late. The final defeat was catastrophic. The Athenian army was crushed. Survivors were forced into the stone quarries of Syracuse, where they suffered under the relentless sun, thirst, and hunger. The once mighty fleet was destroyed, ships burned or captured, leaving Athens hollowed, stunned, and exposed. The news returned to Athens like a cold wind. The scale of the loss was so immense that many could scarcely believe it. A generation of young men, sailors, hoplites, citizens, gone, ships gone, momentum gone, the empire shaken. Sensing weakness, Sparta pressed harder. They fortified Deceleia, a position within Attica itself, cutting Athens off from silver mines and key supplies. Persian gold began to flow to Sparta, supporting its growing fleet. The balance that had once favoured Athens shifted. Inside the city, political turmoil erupted. Oligarchic factions attempted coups. Democracies were restored, then overturned, then restored again. It was as if Athens itself was at war from within, attacking its own foundations while fighting enemies abroad. Finally, in 405 BCE, the Athenian navy faced the Spartans at Aegospotami. It was here, on the shores of the Hellespont, that the last hope of Athenian resistance collapsed. The Spartan commander Lysander struck swiftly, catching the Athenian ships at anchor. The result was devastating. Almost the entire fleet was captured or destroyed. Athens, now without ships, without allies, and with food lines cut, could no longer resist. In 404 BCE, after nearly 3 decades of conflict, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes. The empire dissolved. The once dominant city entered a period of humiliation and hardship. But the end of the war did not bring peace to the Greek world. Sparta emerged as the leading power, but its rule was harsh and inflexible. The cities it sought to control resented its dominance. Athens, though weakened, refused to be erased. Its spirit, forged in philosophy, art, and memory, endured. The Peloponnesian War reshaped Greece more profoundly than any war before it. It broke the unity forged during the Persian Wars. It weakened city-states for generations. It revealed the dangers of ambition, fear, pride, and mistrust. And it left scars, visible and invisible, across the land. But history never ends with a single defeat. A new force was rising in the north, quiet at first, then louder with each passing decade. a kingdom that had watched Greece tear itself apart while strengthening its own foundations. Soon, the story of Greece would turn toward Macedon, and with it, the world would meet a young king whose name would echo through time. When the Peloponnesian War ended, the Greek world did not find peace. Instead, it entered a restless, uncertain age, a time when old powers stumbled, new rivalries formed, and the fabric of the Polis began to fray. Athens was weakened and humbled. Sparta, victorious but strained, struggled to maintain control. The great cities that once shaped the destiny of Greece now quarreled among themselves, exhausted yet unable to step back from conflict. Into this fractured landscape, a quiet power in the north began to awaken. This was Macedon, a land of broad plains, deep forests, and rugged mountains. For centuries, the southern Greeks had looked upon Macedonians with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. They saw them as half barbarian, Greek in language, yet shaped by a wilder world, regal in tradition, yet lacking the structured life of the Polis. Macedon was a kingdom, not a city-state, ruled by a royal family whose authority stretched across tribes, villages, and farmlands. To the south, the Greeks rarely paid close attention to Macedon. It was distant, rural, and politically divided. Its kings struggled to control powerful nobles, and its borders were threatened by neighbouring tribes. Macedon seemed unlikely to play any major role in Greek affairs. But history often turns on unlikely ground. In the early 4th century BCE, while Athens rebuilt its walls and Sparta sought to secure its shaky dominance, Macedon began to stabilise. Its kings strengthened alliances, subdued rival clans, and reformed parts of the military. They secured borders, reorganised cavalry units, and encouraged trade along rivers and coastal ports. Slowly, quietly, Macedon became more cohesive. Meanwhile, the Greek mainland descended further into conflict. Sparta, though triumphant after the Peloponnesian War, found its control slipping. The harshness of its rule bred hostility. Cities it had forced to accept Spartan-backed governments rebelled one by one. Even allies grew resentful. In the 390s BCE, a new war, the Corinthian War, pitted Sparta against a coalition of Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Thebes. Persian gold flowed into Greece, not to conquer, but to manipulate alliances to Persia's advantage. The result was chaos, shifting loyalties, battles on land and sea, and treaties that satisfied no one. Though Sparta survived, it emerged weakened. Its rigid society could not easily replenish the citizen soldiers lost in battle. Its reputation dimmed, Greece was drifting. Then came Thebes. Under the leadership of gifted commanders like Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes challenged Sparta directly. In 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, the Theban army delivered a shocking defeat to Sparta. Using innovative tactics, including the oblique phalanx with a reinforced left wing, the Thebans broke the myth of Spartan invincibility. In the years that followed, they invaded the Peloponnese, liberated Messenia from centuries of Spartan control, and reshaped the balance of power. For a brief moment, Thebes led Greece, but its dominance was fragile. Great leaders died, alliances wavered, and resources grew thin. The Greek world, tired of endless shifts in supremacy, longed for stability but could not create it. It was during this swirl of conflict, distrust, and exhaustion that Macedon found its opportunity. In the mid-4th century BCE, the Macedonian king Amyntas, and later his son Perdiccas III, sought to unify the kingdom. But internal unrest, external enemies, and political instability made their efforts difficult. When Perdiccas III died in battle against the Illyrians in 359 BCE, Macedon seemed on the verge of collapse once again. The throne passed to someone few outside Macedon yet understood. A young man who had spent part of his life as a hostage in Thebes, observing Greek politics and military tactics from within. He learned from generals, watched elite hoplites train, and studied the strengths and weaknesses of the Greek world. His name was Philip, later known as Philip II of Macedon. When Philip took the throne, Macedon was hemmed in on every side. Illyrians to the northwest, Paeonians to the north, Thracians to the east, and rival noble families within. But Philip was not a mere survivor. He was a strategist of extraordinary ability. He began by securing the borders. He forged alliances not through brute force alone, but through diplomacy, marriage, and negotiation. Instead of confronting every threat at once, he neutralized some through treaties and confronted others with swift, decisive action. He reorganized the army from the ground up, introducing reforms that would forever change warfare in Greece. Under Philip, the Macedonian infantry adopted longer spears. The sarissa, a pike far longer than the traditional hoplite spear. Soldiers trained relentlessly in formations that could pivot, advance, or retreat with precision. The cavalry, long a Macedonian strength, was reorganized into elite units known as the companion cavalry, capable of devastating charges. These reforms did something remarkable. They blended the disciplined unity of Greek phalanxes with the flexibility and power of Macedonian mounted forces. Philip created an army that could outmaneuver, outlast, and outfight the fragmented forces of the Greek city-states. While Philip built his power, the Greek cities quarreled as usual. Athens tried to revive naval alliances. Thebes sought to maintain its influence. Sparta looked inward. Its strength diminished. Corinth, Argos, Megara, all navigated their own problems. Each polis lived within its own tight boundaries, each jealously guarding its autonomy, each suspicious of the others. Philip saw what they could not, that disunity made them vulnerable. He moved south methodically. First, he secured control of Macedon itself. Then, he turned to neighboring regions, Thessaly, Thrace, and the northern Aegean. Either conquering or forming alliances, he captured strategic cities, controlled trade routes, and placed garrisons where needed. Every move was measured, every victory building upon the last. To many Greeks, Macedon was still a distant and underestimated kingdom. They saw Philip as another northern king, ambitious but manageable. They assumed that the city-states, with their centuries of military tradition, could resist if needed. But while they debated in their assemblies and council chambers, Philip's power grew. He offered protection to some cities, friendship to others, and pressure to those who resisted. Athens, alarmed by Macedon's rising influence, sent orators like Demosthenes to warn the people of the danger. His speeches, the famous Philippics, thundered through the assembly, urging Athenians to resist before it was too late. But many Athenians were tired of war, reluctant to spend resources, unsure whether Macedon truly posed a threat. Philip continued to move forward, step by step. By the late 350s and early 340s BCE, Macedon had become something new, a unified, centrally directed, militarily formidable state. While the Greek cities looked back at their old rivalries, Philip looked forward toward a vision that reached far beyond Macedon. He saw the Greek world not as a set of separate bickering cities, but as a potential collective power, one he intended to lead. Soon, he would make his intentions unmistakable. Soon, the Greeks would realize that the age of independent city-states was nearing its end. The rise of Macedon was only the beginning. For history was preparing to introduce a young prince who would take Philip's foundations and expand them into an empire stretching across continents. That prince would be Alexander. But first, Greece would have to face Philip himself. On the fields of battle, in the halls of diplomacy, and in the shifting alliances that shaped the late 4th century BCE. The old world was changing, and the footsteps of Macedon were growing louder. When Philip II secured the Macedonian throne, few in Greece imagined that this northern kingdom would soon reshape the destiny of the entire Hellenic world. The city-states, still locked in cycles of rivalry and recovery after the Peloponnesian War, viewed Macedon with a mixture of indifference and vague suspicion. To them, Philip was another tribal monarch, ruling a rugged land far from the heart of Greek culture. But Philip saw what others did not. He saw an opportunity in the exhaustion of Greece, an opening that would allow him to build something entirely new. From the moment he began to rule, he moved with purpose, quietly, steadily, turning Macedon into a force the Greeks could no longer ignore. His first years on the throne were filled with danger. Enemies pressed Macedon on all sides, but Philip met each threat with a mixture of diplomacy and military precision. He strengthened border defenses, bribed hostile leaders, negotiated marriages with powerful families, and struck swiftly at those who resisted. Each victory, each treaty, each alliance tightened his grip on Macedon. By the early 350s BCE, the kingdom was no longer fragile. It was unified, confident, and increasingly formidable. The transformation of the Macedonian army lay at the heart of Philip's rise. He understood that the traditional hoplite phalanx, while strong, lacked the flexibility and reach needed for larger ambitions. So he reformed everything: equipment, training, tactics, even the way men moved together as a single body. Macedonian infantry now carried the sarissa, a pike so long that enemy hoplites struggled to reach through it. Soldiers trained rigorously, learning to stay disciplined even in complex maneuvers. They moved with a precision that surprised Greek observers, maintaining formation over rough terrain where traditional phalanxes faltered. Philip paired this infantry corps with a powerful cavalry. The companion cavalry, drawn from the Macedonian nobility, became one of the most feared units in the ancient world. They charged at key moments, smashing into enemy flanks or driving wedges through their lines. The coordination between infantry and cavalry, something few Greek armies mastered, gave Macedon unmatched mobility and force. With his kingdom secured and his army reformed, Philip turned outward. His eyes first fell upon Amphipolis, a strategic city in Thrace controlling vital trade routes and rich silver mines. Athens had long considered Amphipolis essential to its interests, but Philip took it swiftly, securing wealth and resources that fueled his growing power. He followed this with campaigns in Chalkidiki and Thrace, expanding Macedonian influence across the northern Aegean. Athens protested, but its responses were hesitant. While orators like Demosthenes warned passionately of the Macedonian threat, urging Athenians to act before it was too late, many citizens were weary of war. Memories of the Peloponnesian War's hardships lingered. Others preferred diplomacy or profit from trade. Philip exploited this division masterfully, offering gifts to some, promises to others, and threats where needed. Meanwhile, Philip intervened in the Sacred War, a conflict in central Greece involving Thebes, Phocis, and several smaller states. Pious in appearance but deeply political in practice, Philip's involvement allowed him to enter Greek affairs as a protector. In reality, it provided avenues of influence deep into the heart of Greece. He presented himself as a defender of Apollo's sanctuary at Delphi, gaining legitimacy and alliances while placing Macedonian troops in strategic positions. Each step built upon the last. Each victory expanded his reach. Each alliance eroded the independence of the Polis. As Macedon grew in power, Greece grew more divided. Athens, Corinth, Megara, and other cities struggled to form consistent strategies. Thebes, still a strong force, oscillated between cooperation and suspicion. Sparta watched with narrowed eyes. but lacked the strength to challenge Philip directly. In 346 BCE, the Athenians negotiated the Peace of Philocrates with Macedon, an uneasy treaty meant to stabilize relations. But Philip used the peace not to rest, but to outmaneuver Athens further. He moved through Thermopylae, intervened again in the Sacred War, and positioned himself as arbiter of disputes among Greek states. The treaty, rather than restraining him, gave him space to consolidate power. Demosthenes continued to raise his voice. In the assembly, he thundered warnings about Philip's true intentions, insisting that Macedon sought not peace, but domination. His speeches, filled with urgency and passion, stirred many Athenians, but not enough to overturn the city's reluctance for sustained conflict. Philip, meanwhile, continued his march through Thessaly and Thrace. He founded cities, secured ports, took hostages, and won loyalty through both generosity and fear. By the early 340s, Macedonian influence extended from the Danube to the fringes of central Greece. Tension grew like the tightening of a string. Something had to break. The final strain came from disputes in Boeotia and Amphissa, where local conflicts spiraled into broader political crises. Philip seized these moments skillfully, advancing under the pretext of enforcing sacred decrees. But his path led unmistakably toward confrontation with Athens and Thebes, the last major powers capable of resisting him. In 339 BCE, Athens and Thebes, long rivals, formed an alliance out of necessity. They understood that their differences must be set aside. Philip had grown too powerful. If they did not stand together, Macedon would dominate Greece. The alliance was fragile, built on urgency rather than trust, but its formation signaled that Greece had reached a decisive moment. Philip responded with calm confidence, gathering his troops and marching south. In the summer of 338 BCE, the two sides met in the plain near the small town of Chaeronea. The field was surrounded by gentle hills, open enough for maneuvering yet framed, so that neither side could escape easily. The Greek alliance placed its strongest forces on the wings, Theban elite troops on one side, Athenian hoplites on the other. The sacred band of Thebes, renowned for their bravery and unity, stood ready. Philip commanded the Macedonian right wing. His young son, Alexander, only 18, but already a skilled rider and tactician, commanded the left. The battle began with the steady advance of the Macedonian phalanx, its forest of sarissas glinting in the light. On the wings, cavalry skirmished, dust rose. Shouts echoed. The Athenians, eager to prove themselves, pushed forward with determination. Philip saw their momentum and executed a calculated retreat, not in panic, but in deliberate, controlled steps. The Athenians, believing they were winning, surged ahead, breaking formation as they rushed down the slope. At that exact moment, Philip halted the retreat. His line stabilized, and he ordered the counterattack. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the field, Alexander led the Macedonian companion cavalry in a bold charge against the Theban sacred band. The impact was fierce. The ground trembled with hooves. The clash was relentless. Piece by piece, the Greek line began to break. By late afternoon, the alliance collapsed. The Athenians fled. The Thebans fought to the last. The sacred band, refusing to retreat, was surrounded and destroyed where they stood. The Battle of Chaeronea was over. The independence of the Greek city-states, as it had existed for centuries, was finished. Philip did not destroy his enemies. Instead, he convened the League of Corinth, a new political structure uniting nearly all Greek states under his leadership. Each city retained nominal autonomy, but decisions on war and policy flowed through Macedon. Only Sparta refused to join, but it no longer held the power to challenge Philip. Greece was no longer a world of quarreling Polis. It was now part of a larger vision. Philip's final dream was not Greece alone, but an invasion of Persia, the old enemy, the vast empire across the sea. He prepared plans, mustered forces, and envisioned a campaign that would avenge Greece and elevate Macedon to unprecedented heights. But Philip would never lead that campaign. In 336 BCE, he was assassinated in Aegae during a festival, a sudden shocking end to a reign that had reshaped the world. His son, the young general who charged at Chaeronea, stepped forward to take the throne. The world was about to meet Alexander the Great. When Philip II fell beneath an assassin's blade in the theatre at Aegae, the echoes of that moment rippled across Macedon and the entire Greek world. It was a sudden, violent ending, the kind that leaves kingdoms trembling in the quiet that follows. Courtiers froze in shock, nobles whispered in fear, soldiers stared, unsure what this meant for the campaign their king had promised but never begun. Amid the confusion, a young man stepped forward. Not yet 20 years old, but already seasoned, already known, already feared by some. This was Alexander, the son of Philip and the Epirote princess Olympias, a prince raised between worlds, Macedonian in discipline, Greek in culture, and shaped by the fierce ambition of a royal household filled with tension and power. He had studied under Aristotle, learning philosophy, science, poetry, and the legends of heroes. He had hunted lions with his father, led cavalry at Chaeronea, and grown up surrounded by stories of Achilles, the warrior whose fiery temper and unmatched courage had captured the imagination of Greece for centuries. These stories were not simple entertainments for the boy. They were models, mirrors, expectations. To Alexander, greatness was not an inheritance. It was a destiny, but destiny alone could not secure a throne. The moment Philip died, Macedon hovered on the edge of chaos. Rivals within the royal family saw opportunity. Neighboring tribes sensed weakness. Cities across Greece whispered of rebellion. The empire Philip had built in 2 decades could dissolve in weeks. Alexander acted with speed that startled even his supporters. Within hours, he was proclaimed king by the army. The same men who had followed his father into battle, who had seen the young prince ride at Chaeronea with a ferocity well beyond his years. Their loyalty, forged in war, gave him the legitimacy he needed. But legitimacy was fragile. To secure it, Alexander had to move with ruthless clarity. First, he eliminated internal threats. Several nobles suspected of conspiring in Philip's assassination were executed. Rivals who might claim the throne, including some of Philip's other children, were removed. These actions shocked the court, but they stabilized the kingdom. Macedon could not afford a civil war now, not with Persia watching from across the sea and Greek cities sharpening their ambitions. Next, Alexander turned to the borders. Illyrians to the northwest tested his resolve. Thracian tribes stirred in the northeast. Paeonians sought advantage. Alexander marched swiftly, leading troops through rugged mountains and across fast-moving rivers. He moved with the precision of a commander twice his age, striking quickly, decisively, leaving no doubt that Macedon remained strong. These early campaigns did more than secure the frontier. They demonstrated to soldiers and rivals alike that Alexander possessed Philip's courage, and something more. He fought at the front, not behind ranks. In battles, he rode where the danger was greatest, spear in hand, eyes fixed ahead. The army loved him for this. His charisma came not from softness or gifts, but from presence. The sense that he was always in the center of the storm, unshaken. But even as Alexander secured the borders, Greece began to stir. The cities that Philip had forced into the League of Corinth saw in the king's death a chance to break free Athens, whispered of restoring independence. Thebes, long a power in central Greece, weighed rebellion. Other poleis watched carefully, waiting to see if Macedon would crumble. Alexander understood this moment with perfect clarity. If he appeared weak, the entire Greek world would erupt. If he appeared hesitant, Philip's empire would die before it began. So he marched south, not with hesitation, but with force. When the news reached Greece that Alexander was approaching, many cities reconsidered rebellion. Athens hesitated, privately hoping for resistance, but unwilling to act openly. Corinth waited. Argos grew silent. But Thebes miscalculated. Believing Alexander had died in the northern campaigns, Thebes expelled the Macedonian garrison and raised the banner of revolt. It was a bold move, bold but fatal. Alexander did not delay. He marched at a speed that shocked the Greek world, covering immense distances in days. His sudden arrival outside Thebes stunned even the rebels, who had not imagined Macedon could move so quickly. The city resisted. Alexander did not hesitate. The assault was swift, brutal, decisive. Macedonian forces broke through the defences, and Thebes fell. The city, once a rising star of Greece, the home of Epaminondas, the power that humbled Sparta, was destroyed. Houses burned. Walls collapsed. Survivors were sold into slavery or scattered. The territory was divided among neighbouring cities. The destruction of Thebes sent a message that echoed across Greece. Macedon would not tolerate rebellion. The Polis that had challenged Spartan power, reshaped Greek warfare, and stood proudly for generations, had vanished in a single blow. The rest of Greece bowed swiftly. Corinth submitted. Argos submitted. Athens, shaken, sent envoys pleading for mercy. Alexander granted Athens leniency, perhaps out of respect for its culture, perhaps out of strategy. He needed a stable Greece behind him, not a graveyard of ruined cities. With Greece once again under Macedonian control, Alexander turned his attention to the unfinished dream of his father, the invasion of Persia. For centuries, the Persian Empire had stood as one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. Its kings commanded vast lands stretching from Egypt to northern India. Its wealth was legendary. Its armies were enormous. Its court glittered with gold, silk, and traditions older than many Greek cities. But Alexander did not see Persia as untouchable. He saw it as a challenge, a canvas upon which destiny could be drawn. In the spring of 334 BCE, he assembled his forces at Pella and Aegae. Macedonian infantry, companion cavalry, Thessalian horsemen, Greek allied troops, engineers, siege specialists, and supply crews. A diverse yet tightly coordinated army. It was not large by Persian standards, but it was disciplined, innovative, and fiercely loyal to its young king. At Pella, Alexander visited his father's tomb. At Dion, he offered sacrifices to Zeus and the Muses. He honoured Achilles at his shrine, a symbolic gesture linking his own fate to the legendary hero he admired. Then he marched eastward to the coast, where a fleet waited to carry supplies along the shore. Alexander himself led the army across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia according to ancient accounts. He paused in mid-crossing, leaped from his ship, and cast a spear into the land, declaring Asia a prize to be won by conquest. When he stepped onto the Aegean shore, he visited the site where, according to tradition, the poet Homer once told the story of the Trojan War at the tomb of Achilles. Alexander offered garlands and prayed for equal courage and glory. He was no longer just a king, he was stepping into legend. Ahead lay the might of Persia. Ahead lay battles that would carve his name into history. Ahead lay years of relentless march, victories, cities founded, empires shaken. But at this moment, a young king on a quiet shore in Asia, the sea behind him, the vast continent before him, the world was still balanced between the memory of Philip and the promise of Alexander. Soon the two worlds would diverge. and the great campaigns would begin. When Alexander crossed into Asia, he did not bring with him an army large enough to match the full might of Persia on paper. His force was compact, carefully chosen, and built around unity rather than sheer numbers. Behind him lay a relatively small kingdom and a restless Greek world. Ahead stretched an empire with vast reserves of men, money, and land. On maps, the imbalance looked almost absurd, but Alexander was not measuring this campaign by maps alone. He understood momentum, morale, and the power of striking first, hard, and with precision. For him, the invasion had to begin not with hesitation, but with a clear, shocking statement. Macedon was here, and it would not turn back. As the army moved inland from the coast, following dusty roads and crossing low hills dotted with shrubs and scattered trees, news of Alexander's arrival travelled ahead of him. Persian satraps, regional governors answerable to the great King Darius III, gathered their forces and debated what to do. Some argued that they should fall back, draw Alexander deeper into Asia, and overwhelm him later with superior numbers. Others insisted on meeting him quickly, before his presence could inspire rebellion among Greek cities under Persian rule. Pride played its part as well. Few Persian commanders wanted to be remembered as the ones who let a young Macedonian king march unchallenged through their territories. In the end, they chose confrontation. They gathered near a river in northwestern Asia Minor, the Granicus, a winding stream that cut through rolling terrain and rocky ground. It was here that they decided to make their stand. The Granicus was not a massive river, but its banks were steep in places, its current swift enough to cause difficulty for cavalry crossing in formation. To the Persian commanders, it seemed an ideal defensive line. They could line the bank with troops, force Alexander to attack uphill and through water, and perhaps drown his ambition in one sudden reversal. Alexander knew where they waited. His scouts reported the enemy camp and the river's outline. His generals, experienced and cautious, advised him to wait until morning before attacking, to camp for the night on their side of the river, to take time to study the crossings and the positions of the Persian forces. They pointed out the dangers: horses struggling in the current, soldiers vulnerable as they climbed the opposite bank, enemy cavalry waiting above with a clear advantage. It was the logical counsel of men who had seen battle and understood the cost of underestimating terrain. But Alexander did not come to Asia to be cautious. He listened, weighed their words, and then refused to delay. To give the Persians a night to prepare, to allow their confidence to settle, to lose the surprise of an immediate assault. This, to Alexander, was the greater danger. He decided to attack that very day, at once, in a move that would both unsettle his enemies and awaken his own troops to the reality that this campaign would be fought at his pace, not the enemy's. As the Macedonian army approached the Granicus, the Persians could see the dust of their advance, the glitter of spears and helmets catching the sun. Persian cavalry lined the near bank, shoulder to shoulder, with infantry and Greek mercenaries positioned further back. They expected hesitation instead. They saw Alexander organizing his men for a direct crossing. The river, with all its risks, would not be a barrier. It would be the opening act. Alexander arranged his lines carefully. He placed part of his cavalry on the right, including the elite companions, where he himself would ride, as he almost always did, close to the heart of the action, where commands could be given by example as much as by words. The infantry, organized in phalanxes, stood ready to follow. The plan was not to trick the Persians with elaborate maneuvers. It was to overwhelm them with determination and precision in a place where they thought they could simply wait and repel. At the signal, the Macedonian cavalry advanced toward the water. Hooves splashed into the current, sending drops of cold river water into the air. Men shouted to keep their mounts steady as they descended the near bank and pressed into the stream. The Persians watched, perhaps with disbelief at first. Then with urgency, arrows and javelins flew from the upper bank. Horses stumbled on hidden stones. The crossing, as Alexander's more cautious generals had warned, was anything but clean. Yet this was the kind of chaos Alexander understood instinctively. While lesser commanders might have wavered at the sight of their lines struggling in the water, he pushed forward. He urged his horse into the current, making himself visible to his men. If their king could cross first under fire, so could they. The companions followed, splashing through the river in uneven but determined ranks, shields raised, spears angled, trusting that once their horses found footing on the far bank, they could reform and strike. On the opposite side, Persian cavalry rode along the edge, looking down into the water, waiting to meet the Macedonians as they emerged. The clash, when it came, was sudden and brutal. Horses scrambled for balance on the muddy slope. Men tried to swing weapons while still half in the river. Some fell back into the stream, dragged by their armour. Others pushed upward, teeth gritted, knowing that if they could gain even a small patch of flat ground, the tide might turn. Amid this chaos, Alexander pushed to the front. He wore a plumed helmet and distinctive armour, making him easy to recognise. Persian nobles and commanders, themselves proud warriors, aimed for him. Killing the enemy king could end the battle at one stroke. Alexander met them in the swirl of hooves and steel, parrying blows, thrusting his spear, and rallying his men with his presence alone. One Persian noble, Rusaces, attacked him directly. Alexander killed him. Another struck Alexander's helmet, breaking the crest and nearly ending his life. But a companion named Clytus the Black intervened, cutting down the attacker and saving his king in a heartbeat that would echo in later stories. While the cavalry struggled at the river's edge, the Macedonian infantry began to cross in more organised fashion. Guided by officers, the phalanxes entered the water, shields held tight, spears raised above the flow. Once they reached the far bank, they climbed steadily, anchoring the line that the cavalry's initial charge had begun to create. The Persians, who had initially fought with confidence at the top of the slope, now found a growing mass of disciplined infantry pushing up toward them, their long pikes forming a wall. Persian cavalry, so effective on open ground, found itself hemmed in by terrain and by the relentless pressure of the Macedonian advance. They tried to maneuver, to circle and strike the flanks, but space was limited, and the Macedonian formations held. Gradually, the balance shifted. What began as a dangerous uphill battle for the invaders became, through persistence and cohesion, a rolling push outward from the river that the Persians could not contain. Behind the cavalry, Persian infantry and Greek mercenaries watched the struggle. Some accounts suggest that the Greek mercenaries, hardened professionals hired by the Persians, offered to hold their position and let the cavalry fall back, reorganizing for a second stand. But the tide of battle is not easily reversed once it turns, and fear spreads quickly when lines begin to break. As Macedonian troops gained the bank and broadened their foothold, the cohesion of the Persian front dissolved. Soon, the battle shifted from contested crossing to pursuit. Persian cavalry withdrew, then fled. Infantry units, seeing the mounted nobles retreat, lost heart. The mercenaries, left exposed, were attacked directly by the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander, determined to send a message, allowed no easy escape for those who had chosen to fight for Persia against him. Many of the mercenaries were killed. Others were taken prisoner. When the fighting finally ended, the riverbanks were lined with the fallen. The waters of the Granicus, which had sparkled calmly in the morning light, now carried downstream the echoes of the first decisive clash between Macedon and Persia. Alexander had not just won a battle, he had won the right to be taken seriously by an empire that had once ruled vast portions of the known world, almost unchallenged. The immediate consequences were significant. Persian satraps in the region were killed or fled. The Macedonian army gained prestige and confidence. Greek cities in Asia Minor, previously under Persian dominance, began to look at Alexander not as a distant invader, but as a possible liberator. One by one, many of these cities opened their gates to him. He treated them not as conquered foes, but as allies returned to a broader Greek world, abolishing tyrannies, confirming local laws, and promising autonomy under his wider leadership. At the same time, he did not forget to reward his own. He sent spoils and statues back to Greece as offerings and symbols, dedicating captured arms to Athena, presenting himself as the avenger of earlier Persian invasions. In doing so, he wove his victories into a narrative that reached back to Marathon and Salamis, tying his campaign to the memory of those who had fought Persia generations before. The Battle of the Granicus set the tone for everything that followed. It showed that the Macedonian army could cross hostile terrain under fire, defeat Persian cavalry in direct combat, and hold together in the face of confusion. It showed Alexander's men that their young king was not asking them to take any risks. He would not take himself. It showed his enemies that he was willing to act quickly, to ignore the comfortable caution of delay, and to turn even dangerous situations into opportunities. Yet for all its importance, Granicus was only the beginning. The Persian Empire still stood immense and intact. Darius III had not yet faced Alexander in person. The royal capitals, the rich heartlands, the deep reservoirs of Persian strength, all of these lay further east, beyond mountains, plains, and rivers still unknown to the Macedonian army. But the first barrier had been broken. A river that seemed to favour the defenders had become the scene of their defeat. The satraps who thought they could halt Alexander at the frontier had failed, and as the Macedonian camp settled into the quiet of the evening after the battle, as fires burned low and horses rested tethered near the flowing water, those who survived must have sensed that they stood at the threshold of something vast and irreversible. The campaign would continue along the coast, through cities and open fields, toward deeper lands where Persia's true power waited. And in time, at places called Issus and Gaugamela, the world would see just how far Alexander's ambition and the reach of his army could extend. After the victory at the Granicus, the nature of Alexander's campaign changed. Before that battle, he was an intruder at the edge of the Persian Empire, a young king testing his strength against regional governors. After it, he was something far more dangerous, a proven conqueror moving through Asia Minor with growing confidence, reputation, and momentum. The cities along the coast, many of them Greek in culture but long under Persian rule, watched carefully as his army advanced. Some hesitated, uncertain whether to resist or negotiate. Others opened their gates and welcomed him as a liberator, hoping this new power from the north would restore what they saw as their freedom. Alexander understood how important these perceptions were. When cities surrendered peacefully, he often confirmed their laws, reduced or cancelled tribute, and presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of order. When tyrants installed by Persia ruled, he removed them. Temples were honoured, local customs respected. These gestures were not merely kindness, they were strategy. Each city that chose to stand with him voluntarily strengthened his supply lines and weakened Persia's hold without the need for prolonged sieges. Yet not all chose peace. Some, like the city of Halicarnassus, resisted fiercely and had to be taken by force, reminding Alexander that even perceived liberators could quickly become besiegers when interests collided. Still, by the time he had secured most of the western coast of Asia Minor, it was clear that Persia had lost its grip on this important region. Alexander's army moved with a mix of speed and ritual, fighting, negotiating, offering sacrifices, sending messages back to Greece, and steadily pushing eastward. The Persian great king, Darius III, could no longer ignore this threat. He gathered a large army from across his domains. cavalry from the high plains, infantry from the heartlands, contingents from satrapies that stretched from the Mediterranean to beyond the Zagros Mountains. For centuries, Persia had been accustomed to fighting smaller enemies, putting down revolts and asserting royal authority. Now, the king faced an adversary who did not revolt against him, but sought to replace him. The two forces finally met near the town of Issus, in the narrow strip of land between mountains and sea in southern Asia Minor. It was here, in 333 BCE, that Alexander and Darius confronted each other for the first time. The setting shaped the battle. The plain was not wide and open, but confined. Darius, whose strength lay partly in overwhelming numbers and mobility, found his larger army squeezed between natural boundaries. Alexander, leading a smaller but more tightly coordinated force, could use the terrain to his advantage. The Macedonians advanced with their familiar pattern. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, Alexander himself commanding the companion cavalry on the right. The fighting was intense, a collision of two very different worlds. On one side, the Macedonian phalanx pushing forward with long pikes, supported by versatile light troops and relentlessly aggressive cavalry. On the other, the diverse armies of Persia, organized around a royal center where Darius watched the battlefield from a chariot surrounded by noble guards. For a time, the outcome was uncertain. But when Alexander led a decisive charge toward the center, toward the king himself, the balance tipped. Under the pressure of that attack, Darius fled, leaving behind his chariot, his treasure, and even members of his family. The psychological effect of Issus was enormous. For the first time, the great king had personally faced Alexander and run. The legend of Macedonian invincibility grew while the aura of Persian invincibility faded in the Macedonian camp afterward. Alexander found Darius's mother, wife, and children. He chose to treat them with respect, offering comfort rather than humiliation. This did not change the political reality, but it shaped how his enemies and allies saw him. He was a conqueror, but he wished to appear as a noble one. After Issus, Alexander could have marched directly into the heart of the Persian Empire. Instead, he turned south toward the eastern Mediterranean coast. He understood something crucial. As long as Persia controlled the major ports and naval bases, its fleet could threaten Greece and his supply lines. To make his conquest secure, he needed to neutralize Persian power at sea by taking the cities that supported their ships. Most coastal cities submitted, seeing the outcome of Issus as proof of the shifting tide. But Tyre, a proud and wealthy Phoenician city built partly on an island, refused to let Alexander enter and offer sacrifice in its temple of Melkart. The Tyrians did not want a Macedonian army inside their walls, even symbolically. Alexander, viewing this as defiance and a strategic problem, began one of the most famous sieges in ancient history. Tyre's position seemed impregnable. The island city sat offshore, surrounded by strong walls that rose directly from the sea. Its fleets could resupply it. No ordinary siege could reach it. Alexander, however, refused to give up. He ordered the construction of a causeway from the mainland to the island, a massive artificial bridge built of stones, timber, and whatever material his engineers could gather. Day after day, under Tyrian missiles and ships, the causeway crept forward through the shallow water. The Tyrians countered with fire ships and attacks, burning siege towers and killing workers. For months the struggle continued. A contest of engineering and endurance, Alexander brought in more ships, effectively creating his own fleet. Slowly, the balance shifted. When the walls were finally breached and the Macedonian army stormed the city, the fall of Tyre sent a chilling message to the rest of the region. Even the strongest coastal fortress could not hold out forever against this relentless king. From Tyre, Alexander moved further south. Some cities surrendered quickly, others hesitated. At Gaza, he faced another stubborn defender. The city stood on a high mound. Commanding the route into Egypt, Alexander laid siege once more, and after hard fighting, Gaza fell too. The road to Egypt opened. Egypt, long under Persian control, but deeply ancient in its own identity, greeted Alexander not merely as another invader, but as a possible liberator from foreign rule. The Persians were seen by many there as distant rulers who did not fully honor local traditions. When Alexander entered, he showed respect for Egyptian religion, visited the temples, and presented himself as a rightful pharaoh in the tradition of their kings. Near the mouth of the Nile, he chose the site for a new city, Alexandria, which would later become one of the great centers of learning and trade in the ancient world. He laid out its general plan, imagining a place where Greek and Egyptian cultures could meet. He also traveled across the desert to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa, a remote sanctuary in an oasis. What exactly the oracle told him remains wrapped in legend, but ancient sources hint that Alexander was greeted as a son of the god, a figure chosen for a special destiny. Whether he believed this fully or used it as political symbolism, the experience deepened his sense of mission. He no longer saw himself as only a Macedonian king, but as a world ruler under divine favor. With Egypt secured and the eastern Mediterranean coast effectively under his control, Alexander turned his gaze back to the core of the Persian Empire. Darius, having gathered another, even larger army, waited in the plains of Mesopotamia. The encounter would come near a place called Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Unlike Issus, the field of Gaugamela was wide and open, ideal terrain for Persian cavalry and chariot forces. Darius had ordered the ground leveled to help his scythed chariots move unhindered. His army was vast, drawn from every corner of the empire with contingents of horse archers, elite guards, and heavy cavalry. Against that, Alexander's army was still modest in size, but forged in numerous battles, confident and accustomed to following his daring maneuvers. As dawn broke on the day of the battle, the two armies faced each other across the open plain. Alexander adjusted his lines to avoid being outflanked, angling his right wing slightly forward, inviting the Persians to stretch their formation. As they did, gaps opened. When the moment came, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a decisive thrust toward the center once again, aiming directly for Darius and the royal guard, the Macedonian phalanx, holding firm despite pressure on the flanks, advanced in coordination. Dust rose, shouts filled the air, and once more, at the critical point, Darius lost his nerve and fled the field. Gaugamela was more than a victory. It was the effective end of the Persian Empire as a functioning power. After the battle, the royal cities opened one after another. Babylon, with its towering walls and fabled gardens, surrendered. Alexander entered as a conqueror, but allowed religious practices and local customs to continue. Susa, the treasury city, yielded immense wealth. Gold, silver, and precious objects accumulated over generations. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital with its grand terraces and monumental halls, was taken as well. There, in an act still debated by historians, Alexander allowed parts of the city to be burned, perhaps as symbolic revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens more than a century earlier, perhaps as a gesture to satisfy Greek sentiment. Standing among the ruins of what had been the heart of an empire, Alexander had achieved something no Greek had ever done. He had taken down the power that once terrified the cities of his homeland. Persia's kings, from Cyrus to Darius, had ruled lands that seemed beyond the reach of any outsider. Now, their palaces held his banners, and their treasuries poured wealth into his hands. Yet for Alexander, this was not an end. It was a midpoint, a milestone on a path that stretched further east. The old empire lay in pieces, but its eastern satrapies were not yet under his control, nor was the story of his conquests finished. Beyond the Zagros and the desert plains, beyond the mountains and river valleys, lay lands whose people did not see him as a liberator, or even as a rightful successor to the Persian kings, but simply as another foreign invader. In those lands, the resistance would be fierce, the marches long, the campaigns harder and less glorious than the great set-piece battles against Darius Alexander would press on, deeper and deeper into Asia, chasing not just enemies, but a vision of unity and greatness that pushed him past ordinary limits. The Persian Empire had fallen, but the journey of the Macedonian king was not over. Soon, his army would find itself in the highlands of Bactria, among cold winds and stubborn defenders, and later under the monsoon rains of India, where even victory felt heavy. And eventually, in the midst of that long road, Alexander's own strength would begin to waver, reminding the world that even the greatest conqueror walks within the fragile boundaries of a human life. With the Persian Empire broken and its royal capitals brought under Macedonian control, Alexander stood at a crossroads that few conquerors in history ever reach. Most would have stopped there, triumphant, satisfied with a realm that stretched farther and wealthier than any previous Greek leader could imagine. In Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, Alexander could have crowned himself the undisputed master of Asia and spent the rest of his life securing and enjoying his vast dominion. But something in him pushed beyond practicality, beyond the logic of rest or consolidation. The stories of Achilles, the ambition instilled by his mother Olympias, the relentless standards set by his father Philip, and the momentum of victory combined in him to create a hunger that did not fade with conquest. Instead, it grew. Persia had fallen, but to Alexander, the world itself still looked incomplete. After Gaugamela, Darius III fled eastward, hoping to raise new troops among the satrapies beyond the Zagros mountains. Alexander pursued him relentlessly, crossing terrain that was increasingly hostile, mountainous, and dry. He passed through Media, Parthia, and Hyrcania, regions with wide steppes and harsh climates, where local tribes watched his progress with caution. Some submitted, seeing no point in resisting the new lord of Asia. Others fled into mountain strongholds. Alexander, determined to show that he would not allow rebellion or refuge, hunted them down with quick raids and forced marches. Darius himself never faced Alexander again. The great king was betrayed and killed by his own satraps as they fled deeper into the east. When Alexander reached Darius' body, he covered it with his cloak and sent it to be buried with honors. In death, the Persian king became a symbol that Alexander could use, the rightful ruler struck down by disloyalty, leaving Alexander to assume his mantle not merely as conqueror, but as legitimate successor. He adopted Persian dress at times, kept Persian court rituals, and married into Persian nobility, actions that pleased some and angered others. Macedonian veterans, proud and traditional, grumbled that their king was becoming too Aegean. Alexander, however, believed that to rule such a vast land effectively, he needed to blend cultures, not impose one upon the other. From the heartlands of Persia, Alexander turned his army east toward the distant, rugged world of Bactria and Sogdia, lands of high mountains, icy rivers, and fierce tribes who valued their freedom more than any empire's promises. These regions, far from the centers of Persian power, had always been difficult to control. When word came that Bessus, one of the satraps involved in Darius's betrayal, had proclaimed himself king of Persia in these remote lands, Alexander saw not just a political threat, but a personal challenge. He could not allow a pretender who claimed the royal title to stand. So he marched into the highlands, chasing Bessus across vast distances. The The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdia were unlike the sweeping decisive battles of Granicus, Issus, or Gaugamela. There were no grand fields, no massive armies arrayed in formal lines, no singular confrontations that ended in the fall of a capital city. Instead, there were ambushes in narrow passes, skirmishes on steep hillsides, and countless small engagements that slowly wore down the resistance. The climate was harsh, with cold winters, scorching summers, and terrain that exhausted even the hardiest soldiers. The enemy did not present itself in clear formations, but scattered across valleys and fortresses perched on cliffs. Alexander had to learn new tactics, adapt to guerrilla warfare, and maintain morale despite long marches that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the unknown. He built cities, or foundations of them, to secure the territory, leaving behind garrisons and settlers to create pockets of Greek-style order in a landscape resistant to outside rule. He pursued rebels into remote places, personally climbing dangerous heights and wading through freezing rivers. His persistence eventually broke organized resistance, but the cost was high in both men and weariness. Through these struggles, Alexander's character changed. He grew harsher, more suspicious, more demanding. The burden of continuous war, the weight of ruling a massive empire, and the mixture of cultures and loyalties around him began to shape him in ways no victory feast could soften. In Bactria, he met Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. Their marriage symbolized his attempt to unite Macedonian and local traditions, one of many gestures aimed at turning conquered lands into loyal domains. Some of his officers approved, seeing political advantage. Others resented the blending of Greek and non-Greek customs. Yet Alexander pushed forward, convinced that his empire needed unity rooted in shared identity, not domination alone. When Bactria and Sogdia were finally subdued, Alexander's gaze turned further east. In his imagination, beyond the mountains and deserts, lay new horizons, rich lands, and civilizations he had only heard of in travelers' tales. The Persian kings had never fully conquered India, and the thought of going where even they had failed stirred Alexander's ambition. Once more, he summoned his generals, reorganized the army, and led them toward the lands beyond the Hindu Kush. Crossing into the Punjab region, the Macedonians found a world very different from anything they had known. The rivers were broad and powerful, the climate heavy with heat and moisture, and the kingdoms organized under rulers who commanded strong infantry, skilled archers, and war elephants. Animals the Macedonians had never faced in battle. The campaign culminated in the famous Battle of the Hydaspes, where Alexander met King Porus, a ruler tall and proud, mounted on an elephant and commanding a disciplined, formidable army. The battle was fierce and unfamiliar. The elephants created terror among the horses, their weight shaking the earth as they advanced. Archers fired from their backs, and armored infantry protected their flanks. Alexander maneuvered his troops with precision, crossing the river at night during a storm, dividing his forces to confuse Porus, and finally engaging in a long, grinding struggle that tested the limits of his army. When the battle ended, Porus stood defeated, but unbroken. Alexander, impressed by his courage, allowed him to keep his kingdom as a loyal vassal, a gesture that symbolized Alexander's preference for integrating strong local leaders rather than merely destroying them. But even this great victory did not satisfy him. He wanted to march deeper into India, to explore lands no Greek had seen, to chase new legends. His men, however, could go no further. After years of campaigning, endless marching, harsh climates, and the psychological weight of unending distance from home, they reached their breaking point. At the Hyphasis River, they refused to advance. It was the only time in his career that Alexander faced a united refusal. He argued, pleaded, and tried to inspire them with visions of new worlds to conquer, but the army remained firm. Recognizing that forcing them onward could fracture everything he had built, Alexander reluctantly agreed to turn back. The march south along the Indus River became its own ordeal, punctuated by brutal tribal resistance, harsh terrain, and incredible hardship. The return through the Gedrosian desert was even worse, with searing heat, lack of water, and long stretches of barren land that claimed countless lives. By the time the army reached the Persian Gulf, it was battered, exhausted, and transformed. The dreams of further conquests had been replaced by a sense of survival. Back in the Persian heartlands, Alexander attempted to stabilize and reorganize his empire. He held mass weddings between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen at Susa, blending cultures in a symbolic gesture of unity. He promoted Persians into important positions, merging armies and creating a new elite cavalry composed of both Macedonians and Eastern warriors. These policies sparked deep resentment among the older Macedonian ranks, who felt their traditions were being eroded. Tensions rose, culminating in confrontations like the killing of Clytus, the officer who once saved Alexander's life. During a drunken quarrel, Alexander was devastated afterward, but the incident revealed cracks in the once unshakable bond between king and army. Gradually, the pressure of ruling a vast, diverse empire weighed heavily on him. His health suffered. His emotional state became unpredictable. Plans for new campaigns, Arabia, perhaps even further west, were sketched but not fully realized. In 323 BCE, at the age of only 32, while staying in Babylon, Alexander fell ill after a banquet fever gripped him. His strength faded. Surrounded by generals and friends, he could no longer speak. When asked to whom he left his empire, ancient sources say he whispered, "To the strongest," or perhaps simply indicated that his empire should go to the best. With his death, the unity of the empire shattered almost instantly. His generals, known as the Diadochi, divided the territories, fighting bitterly for supremacy. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus gained much of Asia. Antigonus and his descendants fought for control of Macedon and Greece. Instead of one empire, a Hellenistic world emerged, a collection of kingdoms where Greek language, art, and culture blended with local traditions from Egypt to Afghanistan. Cities founded by Alexander, especially Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of learning, trade, and innovation. The Library of Alexandria grew into a beacon of knowledge, drawing scholars from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The Hellenistic period was an age of mixture and exchange. Greek art became more expressive and emotional. New philosophies emerged: Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, each offering ways to navigate a world larger and more complex than the old city-state model. Scientists studied the stars, measured the earth, and explored mathematics with new depth. Trade connected distant regions, blending spices, fabrics, ideas, and stories. Alexander's conquest had opened pathways that reshaped the ancient world more profoundly than any single ruler's ambition had before. Yet even this rich cultural age carried within it the seeds of future change. In the West, a new power was rising, a disciplined, ambitious republic that expanded steadily through Italy, and then beyond Rome, watched the Hellenistic world with growing interest. Its legions would soon march eastward, challenging kingdoms weakened by internal rivalry. The world Alexander had created, through blood and vision, would eventually fall under Roman control. But before that final transformation, Greece itself would face its last chapter, one shaped not by kings from Macedon or Persia, but by a power that would redefine the ancient world for centuries to come. The rise of Rome was approaching, and with it, the final act in the long story of ancient Greece. When Alexander died in Babylon, a single empire briefly stretched from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. But empires built on the vision of one man do not last long without that vision guiding them. The generals who surrounded his deathbed, men who had marched with him for years, who had crossed deserts and mountains, fought battles from Egypt to the Punjab, now found themselves staring at an impossible question. Who could replace him? Who could hold all of this together? There was no answer. No one alive possessed his charisma, his authority, or the ability to command loyalty across cultures and continents. What followed was not unity, but fragmentation. The realm split into great kingdoms ruled by the Diadochi, the successors who carved their dominions from the enormous canvas Alexander left behind Egypt, went to the Ptolemies, whose dynasty would endure for nearly 3 centuries until the time of Cleopatra. The vast stretches of the East, Persia, Mesopotamia, and beyond, formed the Seleucid Empire under Seleucus Macedon, and Greece fell under the sway of the Antigonid dynasty. Dozens of smaller states, satrapies, and regional powers emerged in between, each shaped by its own ambitions and conflicts. This era, the Hellenistic Age, was one of contradiction. Politically, it was unstable, with shifting alliances, court intrigues, and wars between successor kingdoms. Yet culturally, it blossomed with extraordinary brilliance. Greek language became the lingua franca of a vast region. Greek architecture and sculpture appeared in cities thousands of kilometers from Athens. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine experienced new golden periods. The Library of Alexandria became the greatest center of knowledge the world had ever seen, housing scrolls that measured the breadth of human thought. Scholars like Euclid perfected geometry. Eratosthenes measured the earth. Archimedes explored physics with a depth that still astonishes. Markets bustled with goods from every corner of the known world. Spices from India, papyrus from Egypt, furs from the Black Sea, precious metals from Anatolia. The Mediterranean became a highway of cultural exchange. The Hellenistic world was a living tapestry, woven from the threads of countless peoples brought into contact by the shockwaves of Alexander's conquests. But beneath this vibrancy lay fractures. The kingdoms founded by the Diadochi were large, often too large to govern easily. Local revolts where frequent kings spent more time fighting each other than building long-term stability. And the old Greek homeland, the place where city-states had once flourished, found itself weakened. Overshadowed by larger powers, Athens still produced philosophers and orators. Sparta still held to its austere traditions. Thebes had been rebuilt, though it would never again reach its former heights, but none of them possessed the strength to shape the wider world as they once had. While the Hellenistic kingdoms fought among themselves, a new force grew in the west, quiet at first, then more assertive, then unstoppable. The Roman Republic, originally a regional power in central Italy, expanded steadily through discipline, organization, and relentless ambition. Its legions moved with precision. Its political system, though complex and often contentious, produced leaders capable of long-term strategy and administration. Rome looked eastward, not with immediate conquest in mind, but with the knowledge that controlling the Mediterranean would eventually require confronting the Hellenistic states. The turning point came with King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a descendant of Alexander's general and a brilliant commander in his own right. He crossed into Italy in the early 3rd century BCE to support Greek colonies threatened by Rome. His victories against the Romans were costly, so costly that the term Pyrrhic victory still describes a win that destroys the victor. He defeated Roman armies in battle, but could not break Roman resilience, organization, or population strength. When he withdrew, he famously said, "Another such victory, and we are undone." Rome remembered, and Rome learned. Over the next century, Rome turned its attention to the Hellenistic East with increasing confidence. The Macedonian kings, once feared under Alexander, found themselves challenged by Roman commanders, who who approached war with methodical and adaptable strategies. The First Macedonian War ended inconclusively, but the Second, fought against Philip V, revealed Rome's growing determination. The decisive blow came with the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, when Rome crushed Macedon with brutal efficiency. The Antigonid dynasty fell. The Macedonian kingdom, which had once reshaped Greece, was shattered. Greece itself resisted in pockets. Some states tried to negotiate with Rome. Others rebelled. The Aegean League, a confederation of Greek cities, attempted to preserve autonomy, but resistance could not stop the momentum of a rising empire. In 146 BCE, after a final revolt, the Romans marched into the Peloponnese. They destroyed the city of Corinth, once a vibrant center of trade and culture. Its population was killed or enslaved. Its treasures were carried away. The image of Corinth burning marked, symbolically and politically, the end of ancient Greece as an independent world. From that point on, Greece became a province first under Roman administration, then under Roman cultural absorption. Yet what is remarkable, almost paradoxical, is that Greece did not fade with conquest. Instead, its intellectual and artistic influence entered Rome like dye entering cloth, transforming everything it touched. Roman nobles learned Greek-Roman writers modeled their works on Greek poetry and history. Roman religion merged with Greek gods. Greek sculpture set the standards for beauty. Greek philosophy guided Roman leaders. Even Roman education became thoroughly Greek in form. The Greece that fell militarily rose culturally, shaping the very civilization that had conquered it. Under Roman rule, cities like Athens, Corinth, rebuilt later, and Delphi remained vital centers of learning. Travelers from across the empire visited the ruins of classical temples, listened to philosophers in the Agora, and walked the same paths once taken by Socrates, Pericles, and the heroes of earlier ages. Greece became not a defeated land, but a revered homeland of knowledge, a place Romans considered their intellectual ancestor. As centuries passed, the Greek language continued to dominate the eastern half of the Roman Empire. When Christianity emerged, its first texts were written largely in Greek, its concepts shaped by Greek philosophical vocabulary. Even after the fall of Rome in the west, the Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, remained profoundly Greek in culture. In this way, Greek identity endured through transformations, conquests, and collapses, continually reshaping itself without disappearing. Looking back across the full story, from the farming villages of the Neolithic, through the palaces of the Minoans, the warlike glories of Mycenae, the collapse of the Bronze Age, the rise of the Polis, the classical triumphs of Athens and Sparta, the clash with Persia, the brilliance of the Golden Age, the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War, the rise of Macedon, the conquests of Alexander, the expanse of the Hellenistic world, and the final absorption into Rome. What emerges is not a simple narrative, but a long arc of reinvention. Greece's greatness did not lie only in military victories. It lay in its ideas, its questions, its experiments in how humans might live together, the concept of citizenship, the search for truth, the desire to understand the cosmos, the creation of drama that explored the deepest parts of the human psyche, the pursuit of beauty in stone and bronze, the belief that even in the brief span of human life, the mind could stretch toward the eternal. Empires rise and fall, cities are built and destroyed, battles are won and forgotten, but the spirit that once lived in those hills and shores, the curiosity, the courage, the imagination, proved more lasting than any fortress or throne. And so, as history moved forward and new powers rose to shape the world, the legacy of ancient Greece continued to echo in languages, laws, sciences, philosophies, and stories. It survives in the architecture of modern cities, in the words we speak, in the ideas we debate, in the principles that guide nations, in the myths that still fascinate, in the questions we still ask. This is the true end of the story, an ending that is not an ending at all, but a passage into something larger. Greece ceased to be a sovereign power, but it became something far greater, a foundation of the world that came after. Its legacy remains woven into the fabric of human civilization. And so, the long journey of ancient Greece, from humble villages to mighty empires, from collapse to rebirth, from conquest to legacy, rests quietly in the memory of the world. A story that continues to shape us, long after the last marble column fell and the last city-state faded into history.